Silas Ketchum grabbed Mabel's arm before she even had both feet on the ground. Not a greeting. Not a hand offered to help her down from the coach step. A grip fingers digging into the muscle above her elbow, like she was a piece of luggage he was checking for damage. Turned her, slowly, the way a man examines livestock at auction. His eyes moved from her face down and back up again, and whatever he had been expecting, she was not it. "Lord Almighty," he said. Not quietly. "They said you were a big woman." "They didn't say you were." He stopped. It made a sound low in his throat. "How much did you eat on the way out here?" The people standing near the depot heard it. Every one of them. If this story already has your attention, if you feel that anger rising in your chest, then you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was made for. Please take a moment right now to hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from, because I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. And if you don't want to miss what happens next to Mabel, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more shocking than this one. Now, let's go back to that depot, because Silas Ketchum made a very serious mistake that morning, and he was about to find out exactly what kind of woman he had brought all the way from Missouri. The stagecoach had pulled into Coldwater Ridge just past noon on a Thursday in early December, and the cold off the mountains was the kind that didn't just chill you, it found the spaces between your bones and settled there. Mabel Whitlock had been traveling for 11 days. 11 days on coaches that smelled like wet wool and tobacco spit, eating hard biscuits and salt pork at relay stations, sleeping upright against strangers when she slept at all. She was tired in the particular way that goes past the body and gets into a person's character, the kind of tired that makes you sharp instead of soft, that strips away the politeness you normally carry, like a coat, and leaves something more honest underneath. She had not expected a warm welcome. She was 30 years old in a world that considered a widow past 30 to be already used up, already past the point of being chosen again. She was heavyset in a way that people noticed before they noticed anything else about her, before her eyes, which were quick and dark and missed very little, before her hands, which were capable and ink-stained from years of ledger work, before the particular set of her jaw which suggested she had learned to expect the worst from people and had developed a policy about it. She had not, if she was honest with herself, expected to be loved. She had expected a reasonable arrangement. A man who needed help managing a household and maybe the books on a working ranch, who would offer in return a roof and a measure of stability and the simple dignity of being a wife, rather than a widow dependent on relatives who made their charity felt. The letters from Silas Ketchum had been practical and, she'd thought, honest. He'd said he wanted a capable woman. He'd said her appearance was not the point. He'd said Colorado was hard country but fair country, and that a woman with sense and backbone could build a good life here. She had believed him, because she'd wanted to, and that was the most expensive mistake she'd made in years. The hand on her arm came before she had properly registered his face. She caught an impression: broad shoulders, a face that had once been handsome and had since gone to something harder, and then his fingers closed, and she understood immediately that this was not a man who had ever been told no by anyone he thought was beneath him. "How much did you eat on the way out here?" The words landed in the cold air and just sat there. Mabel heard someone near the depot door pull in a breath. A woman with a basket of dry goods looked away. Two men by the water trough suddenly found their boots extremely interesting. Mabel looked down at the hand on her arm. Then she looked up at Silas Ketchum's face. "Let go of my arm," she said. His expression shifted not to anger exactly, but to something that was a cousin of it: surprise. The specific surprise of a man who has said something genuinely cruel and expected either tears or silence and received neither. "You'll want to mind your tone out here," Silas said. "This isn't Missouri. Women don't—" "I said let go of my arm." He didn't let go. He actually tightened his grip slightly, and Mabel felt the pressure of it settle into a bruise she'd gotten 2 days ago when he'd grabbed her at the relay station outside of Pueblo. She had not had a chance to examine it. She suspected it had gone from red to purple by now. She filed the information away without changing her expression. "You look nothing like your photograph," Silas said. "Photographs lie," Mabel said. "Apparently so do letters." Something moved across his face at that. She watched it move. She'd spent years reading men across counters and desks, years as a land office clerk watching men's faces, when they were told their claim had problems, when they were told there was an error in the filing, when they were told the fee had gone up and she knew what a man looked like when he'd been caught, even partially, even when he wasn't going to admit it. Silas released her arm and stepped back. He was recalibrating. Could see it happening. "You're going to find things are done differently out here," he said. His voice had dropped slightly lowered to the register that men used when they wanted women to understand that the conversation was over. "I arranged this travel at considerable expense. You'll get yourself into my wagon, and we'll discuss expectations on the way to the ranch." "I don't think I will," Mabel said. "I beg your pardon?" "I don't think I'll get into your wagon." She reached down and picked up her traveling bag from where it had fallen in the scramble to get her arm free. Her shoulder ached. Her knees ached from 11 days of rattling over frozen roads. She was cold, and she was exhausted, and she was standing in a strange town where she knew absolutely nobody. And she was more frightened than she had been, since the day her husband's body was brought home in the back of a neighbor's cart. But fear and action were not, in her experience, mutually exclusive. "I have questions before I go anywhere with you. Starting with why those letters describe circumstances that appear to be substantially different from what I am looking at right now." Silas stared at her for a moment. Then he turned to look at the small cluster of people who had gathered, not in a helpful way, not in the way of people who intended to do something, but in the way of people who are watching something and are grateful it isn't happening to them. "She'll settle down," he said to nobody in particular. "I am settled," Mabel said. "This is me settled." She heard something, then a small sound, not quite a laugh, stifled quickly. She didn't look to find where it came from. She kept her eyes on Silas. Face was doing something more complicated now. The recalibration she'd seen earlier had moved into a different register, something that looked like calculation. He took a step toward her, and this time when he reached for her arm, his grip was not the grip of a man making a point. It was the grip of a man who intended to move a person from one place to another, whether that person agreed or not. "You're coming with me," he said, close to her ear, "right now, and you will not embarrass me in the street." "You're hurting me," Mabel said, clearly, so the people standing nearby would hear it. "Take your hand off me." Silas did not take his hand off her. He started walking, pulling her toward the wagon, and for a moment, just a moment, Mabel thought about what happened if she simply went. If she calculated the situation practically, the way she'd always tried to calculate things. She didn't know this town. She didn't know these people. She had $11.40 and a carpet bag with most of her worldly possessions in it, and the nearest place she'd had anything like a home was 11 days away. Going with Silas, she reasoned, might be the only practical option. She could assess the situation from inside. She could find a way to manage it. Could. The hand tightened. Something in Mabel stopped calculating. "I am not going with him." Her voice came out louder than she expected, steadier than she felt. The words fell into the cold air of the street with a kind of weight that surprised even her. Silas stopped walking. She felt the hesitation in him, the split-second uncertainty of a man who had expected resistance to collapse at the right amount of pressure and was discovering it was not going to. "Nobody asked you," he started. She said, "She's not going." The voice came from her left. Low even, carrying without being raised. Mabel turned her head and saw a man she hadn't noticed before he'd been standing near the hitching rail, slightly back from the small crowd that had gathered, and she wasn't sure if he'd been there the whole time, or had just arrived. He was broad-shouldered in a way that was functional rather than showy, wearing a coat that had been repaired at one elbow and trail-worn boots. His hat was pulled against the cold. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, and he was looking at her face, at the bruise along her cheek, which she knew was visible because of the way the woman with the basket had flinched when she'd first climbed down from the coach. He was looking at her arm where Silas's hand was still clamped, and then he was looking at her eyes. Not in the way men usually looked at her, not the quick assessment followed by a decision about what category she belonged in. He was looking at her the way you look at someone you are trying to accurately understand. "Step back," Silas said to him. "I'll step back when she asks me to," the man said. He still wasn't shouting. He hadn't moved from where he was standing. But something about the stillness of him made Silas's grip on Mabel's arm loosen slightly, not release. But loosen, as if Silas was doing a quick, involuntary recalculation of his own. "This is none of your business, Calloway." She made it everyone's business when she said no in the middle of the street. The man Calloway apparently finally moved. He stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, just a deliberate closing of the distance between himself and Silas. Now either you let go of her arm right now, or I'm going to go get the deputy. And then you and I and the deputy can have a conversation about those bruises on her face, which don't look like stagecoach bruises to me." The silence that followed was of a particular quality Mabel recognized. It was the silence of a moment that had become a hinge, the kind that swings once and doesn't swing back. Silas released her arm. He did it in the way of a man performing a choice he was being forced into slowly, deliberately, so that everyone watching would understand that he was choosing to comply and not being compelled, that the distinction mattered to him. He stepped back. He straightened his coat. "You're making a mistake," he said to Calloway. "Taking something that doesn't belong to you." "She's not a something," Calloway said. He said it without heat, just as a correction, like pointing out an error in a ledger. Then he looked at Mabel again. Direct. No performance about it. "My name's Bram Calloway. I know a place you can get warm and work out what you want to do next. If you want to come, I'll take you there. If you'd rather go somewhere else, I'll help you figure out where that is." He paused. "That's it. That's the whole offer." Mabel looked at him. She looked at Silas. She looked at the people standing in the cold, watching this, some of them with the pinched, uncomfortable expression of people who have witnessed something they wish they hadn't and are already composing the version of it they'll tell later. Picked up her carpet bag. "Thank you," she said to Bram Calloway. "I'll come." They started walking. She was aware of the sound her boots made on the frozen ground, of the cold getting into the bruise on her arm, of the stiffness in her back from too many days in a coach. She was also aware of Silas behind her. "You'll regret this," Silas called after them. "Both of you. Bram Calloway, you're taking something that belongs to me. You want to remember that." Mabel stopped. She didn't plan to stop. Her body simply stopped, her feet planting on the frozen ground, with a decision that arrived before she could think about it. Turned around. She looked at Silas Ketchum standing in the middle of the street with his face red from cold and something else, something uglier than cold. "I never belonged to you," she said. "Not for one single hour of any day since those letters were written. Whatever you thought you arranged, it was not ownership of me. And I'd suggest you remember that very clearly in whatever comes next." She turned back around and kept walking. She heard Bram Calloway fall into step beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer his arm or try to guide her. He just walked at the same pace, slightly to her left, between her and the street. It occurred to her, in some cold, practical corner of her mind, that she had just made a choice, with essentially no information, and no leverage in a town where she knew nobody, following a stranger she'd met 45 seconds ago. She was aware of how that looked. She was aware of how many ways it could go badly. She was also aware, and this was the thing she didn't have a good, rational account for, that when Bram Calloway had looked at her face and her arm, and then looked at her eyes, he'd been looking for what she wanted to do. Not what he thought she should do. Not what would be least inconvenient for everyone. What she, Mabel Whitlock, widow of Missouri, wanted to do. It had been a while since someone had looked at her like that. Kept walking. Bram's wagon was at the far end of the street, a plain working rig with a canvas cover in the back. He didn't help her up into it. He moved to do so, and then stopped when she was clearly already managing the step herself, pulling back his offered hand and letting her find her footing. She noticed that, too. They were out of town and onto a track heading north before either of them said anything. "Those bruises," Bram said finally. "Were those from him?" "The one on my arm is from this morning," Mabel said. "The one on my face is from 2 days ago, outside Pueblo, when I started asking questions about the letters." She kept her eyes on the road ahead of them, the frozen track cutting through winter-pale scrub. "I had expected, when I raised the discrepancies between what the letters promised and what I was finding, that he'd at least have a prepared response. He didn't. He just grabbed me and told me to stop asking stupid questions." Bram was quiet for a moment. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "What did the letters promise?" he asked. "A partnership," Mabel said. That was the word he used. Partnership. He said he had a working ranch that needed someone who understood accounts and records. He said the size of a woman's figure had nothing to do with whether she could keep a clean set of books. She paused. He said he wanted a capable woman rather than a decorative one. "And what did you find instead?" "A man who'd never had any intention of marrying me at all," Mabel said. "Or, if he did, the marriage was incidental to something else." She glanced at him sideways. You know what the something else is, don't you? Because you stepped in very quickly for a man who just happened to be passing by the depot. Bram turned to look at her. She saw something shift in his expression, the specific look of a man reassessing the person he's talking to. I've been watching Silas Ketchum for 6 months, he said. Watching him for what? Watching him work for a man named Thaddeus Vane. Mabel turned that name over. It didn't mean anything to her yet, but she filed it. And what does Thaddeus Vane do? She asked. He buys land, Bram said. Or he takes it, depending on how much resistance he meets. The line cabin was about 4 miles north of town, set back from the track behind a stand of bare cottonwoods. It was small, a single room with a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a cot, but the roof looked solid, and someone had recently cut and stacked firewood against the outside wall. Bram got the stove going, while Mabel sat at the table and unwrapped the scarf from around her neck and started examining the bruise on her arm in the limited light. Bad. She'd known it was bad from the way it felt, but seeing the coloration deep purple red spreading from elbow to mid-bicep was still unpleasant. She palpated it carefully. Not broken, just thoroughly abused. There's some cloth in the box under the cot, Bram said without looking up from the stove, and a jar of something that smells terrible but helps with bruising. My brother's wife's recipe. Thank you, Mabel said. She found the cloth and the jar. The smell, when she opened it, was genuinely terrible, a combination of camphor and something she didn't want to identify, but she'd worked with worse. She applied it carefully, wrapped the cloth around it, and was rebuttoning her sleeve when Bram set a tin cup of coffee on the table in front of her and sat down in the opposite chair. He looked at her straight. No preamble. Thaddeus Vane has been buying up land along a proposed railroad route for about 2 years, he said, quietly, using different names, different agents, staying well back from the visible transactions. When people sell willingly, he pays in cash. When they don't sell willingly, he stopped. Go on, Mabel said. Intimidatious, mostly. Hired men who make things difficult. Cattle that end up in wrong pastures. Fences that come down. Water access that gets disputed. Legal claims against deed filings. Court costs that small ranchers can't afford to fight. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. And at least 2 cases that I know of where there were accidents. Men who'd refused to sell and then had accidents that left their properties in a state where their surviving family couldn't hold on. What kind of accidents? One was a fire. One was a fall from a horse on a trail he'd ridden 100 times. He stopped again. The second one was my brother. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the wind made a low sound through the cottonwoods. I'm sorry, Mabel said. His name was Everett. He had 160 acres east of town that sits right on the proposed corridor. He had water rights that are worth more than the land. Bram's voice was careful, controlled. He'd refused 3 separate offers. Last March, his horse came back to the barn without him. They found him at the bottom of a draw 2 days later. He looked up at Mabel. Everyone called it an accident. But Everett was the best horseman I ever knew, and that trail was... He shook his head. It doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is that 3 weeks after the funeral, someone filed a deed transfer that supposedly had Everett's signature on it, selling his property to a holding company I've since traced back to Vane. With a forged signature, Mabel said. Presumably. Can't prove it. I have documents I've collected over 6 months' filings, transfers, witness statements, but there are problems with the chain of evidence. Things that don't quite line up. And every person in this valley who might testify to any of it is too frightened to do it. He met her eyes. Silas isn't the power here. He's just Vane's local agent. His job is to handle the small problems. You were one of them. Mabel set down her coffee. My property, she said. The 40 acres I inherited from my father sits exactly on the southern edge of the proposed corridor, Bram said. And unlike Everett's land, there's been no deed transfer yet. Presumably, because the plan was to handle it through the marriage arrangement, get you out here, get the paperwork in order, and then either have you sign something or... He didn't finish that sentence. Or have an accident, Mabel said. Bram's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. Let me see your documents, Mabel said. He looked at her with the expression she was getting familiar with the second look expression. The one that meant he was updating something. All of them, she said. Whatever you've collected. Set it out on this table. These are 6 months of work, he said. Not protectively, she could hear that it wasn't protectiveness. He was trying to calibrate how serious she was. I know what 6 months of document work looks like, Mabel said. I spent 4 years as a land office clerk in Jefferson City. Before that, I kept accounts for a surveying firm. I know what a forged deed looks like, and I know what a fraudulent witness signature looks like, and I know how territorial filing requirements work. She looked at him directly. I am tired of being treated as the problem to be solved. Show me the problem we are actually dealing with, and let me think about it. He looked at her for another moment. Then he got up, went to the corner of the cabin, and started pulling oilskin packets from beneath a loose floorboard. When he laid the documents out on the table between them, there were more than she'd expected. Deed transfers, notarized statements, recorded filings, hand-drawn property maps with annotations, court records, letters. Thorough. But as Mabel started working through them, setting things into groups, turning pages toward the light, going back and forth between documents, and looking at dates, she began to see the problem. Not one problem. Several. This witness signature, she said, setting a finger on one document. This is notarized by what's this stamp? Is this the county recorder's official stamp? It should be, Bram said, leaning over to look. When was this stamp issued? Mabel asked. I don't know. You need to know. Because this document is dated September of last year, and if that stamp wasn't issued until October, she didn't finish the sentence. She moved to another document. And this transfer here, this property description. Read it to me. Bram read it. Now read me the adjacent document, Mabel said. Same parcel filed 6 months earlier. He read it. Those are different descriptions, Mabel said, for the same property. One of them has been altered. She kept moving through the documents, quiet and intent, not performing her concentration but actually concentrating. The cold had settled out of her bones with the coffee and the warmth from the stove, and something in her that had been braced against impact for 11 days of travel was now, paradoxically, beginning to steady because there was work to do that she knew how to do, and that was almost always better than waiting. You said people were too frightened to testify, she said, without looking up. Every person I've approached has told me they'd like to help, and then found reasons not to. What about the families who lost property? The ones where there were adverse filings against their deeds? 3 families I've identified. 2 of them have left the area. The third, he stopped. The third is a widow named Dora Hatch. She's still on the property her husband held. There's a legal dispute pending on her deed, but it hasn't been resolved yet because she refuses to sign anything and refuses to leave. He paused. She also refuses to talk to me because she's decided the safest thing is to pretend nothing is wrong and she doesn't know anything. I wonder if she'd talk to another widow, Mabel said. Bram didn't answer immediately. She could feel him looking at her. You were looking for someone brave enough to testify, Mabel said, turning to another document. You should have been looking for someone who understands the paperwork. A long pause. I think, Bram said slowly, that Silas made a very bad mistake this morning. He made several, Mabel said, but the most significant one was underestimating what I'd do when I found out what was going on. She turned another page. This date is all wrong. This document is backdated. Look at the witness. The same name appears here and here, and here on 3 different documents on the same day in 3 locations that are at least 20 miles apart. Whoever forged these was either sloppy or confident. Nobody would look closely enough to notice. Nobody has, Bram said. For 2 years. Well, Mabel said. Nobody was looking who understood what they were looking at. She set the documents down in careful order and looked at Bram across the table. I need to get to the county recorder's office tomorrow morning when it opens. I need to file my father's deed and register my claim, because right now I'm not in the territorial record and that leaves me vulnerable. And then I need to see 18 months of public property filings. All of them. Because what I'm seeing in your documents suggests this is much larger than you've found so far. She paused. Will Silas try to stop me? He'll try, Bram said. Can you keep him from succeeding until I get in front of a recorder with evidence? Bram considered this seriously. For a while, he said. The deputy is not Vane's man, as far as I can tell. The recorder is harder to read. But the morning hours, before Vane's people understand what's happening, yes. I can give you that window. Then that's what we need, Mabel said. They sat across the table from each other in the warmth of the small stove. Documents spread between them, and outside the cottonwoods moved in the dark wind, and neither of them talked about what might happen if the plan didn't work, because there was no particular point in that conversation, and they both knew it. Bram refilled her coffee without asking. She accepted it without thanking him, because they were past that kind of politeness and into the kind of working proximity where you just do what needs doing. Around midnight, they were still at the table when both of them heard it at the same time, the sound of horses on the frozen track, coming fast. Bram was on his feet before Mabel had fully registered what she was hearing. He moved to the window, the single small window, facing the track, and looked out. "Two riders," he said, "Silas's men." "How do you know?" "I know those horses." He turned from the window. His voice hadn't changed register, but his entire body had shifted alert, reading the room for options. "Back window opens from the inside. I can get you out in 30 seconds. But the documents." "I'll carry them," Mabel said. "They're heavy, and the creek is frozen. The crossing is rough." "I'll carry them," she said again. "Don't treat me like I haven't been through rough terrain. I just spent 11 days in a stagecoach." He looked at her for 1 second. Then he started bundling the oilskin packets. She took the largest bundle herself. It was heavier than she'd expected, and the cold hit her like a wall when Bram got the back window open and helped her through the frame. Her knees ached. Her arm where the bruise was throbbed with the cold. She could hear voices from the front of the cabin. Now the riders had pulled up and were calling Bram's name. Creek crossing in the dark, on ice that flexed under her boots, carrying a bundle of documents and not letting herself think about what happened if the ice didn't hold. That was not something she would have described as going well. She slipped twice. The second time, she went down hard on one knee and felt something in her leg protest sharply, and the cold from the ice came right through her skirt and her petticoat, and it was genuinely painful. Bram's hand appeared in the dark beside her, not on her arm, not guiding her, just there, offered. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it, and he helped her upright, and then he let go, and she held the documents against her chest and kept moving. They made the far bank and moved into the trees, and the riders didn't follow. She could hear them at the cabin, voices raised, the sound of a door being checked. Bram was breathing hard beside her. She was breathing hard, too, her knee sending sharp reports up her leg with every step, her arm aching, her lungs unhappy about the cold air. Neither of them spoke. They kept moving through the dark. By the time the sky had begun to shift from black toward the particular dark gray that preceded dawn in winter, they had put enough distance between themselves and the cabin that Bram allowed them to stop moving. They sat against a fallen log in a scrub pine grove, and Mabel checked the documents. The oilskin had kept them dry through the creek crossing, and they were intact. She sat back against the log and let herself breathe. "When that opens up in the morning," she said, looking toward where she calculated the town to be, "I'm walking in. I'm not hiding. I'm not waiting for a better moment." She paused. "I'm not leaving Colorado." Bram looked at her. In the early gray light, his face was hard to read. "You sure?" he said. "I came a long way," Mabel said. "And I came to build something, not to run from something." She shifted the documents to a more comfortable position. "I didn't expect it to be this. But it's what's in front of me." She paused. "Do you think I can't do this?" "No," Bram said without any hesitation. "I think you can do it. I think Silas Ketchum and Thaddeus Vane have never in their lives dealt with someone who can do what you can do." He stopped. "I think I've been trying to fight this thing with brute force for 6 months because I didn't know there was another kind of force available." Another pause. "I'm sorry about my brother, and I'm sorry I couldn't stop what happened to you before today." Mabel looked at him for a moment. It was an odd thing to say, not a performance of sympathy, but something more direct than that, more honest about what he was actually sorry for. "You stepped in," she said, "when nobody else did. That's the least that should have happened." "Maybe," Mabel said, but it was more than most people managed. The light was growing. The town was somewhere ahead of them, and the county recorder's office would open in a few hours, and Thaddeus Vane's people would be regrouping after the night's failed search. Everything that happened next would happen in public, in daylight, in front of witnesses, and Mabel was going to have to walk in there, looking like a woman who had spent the night crossing a frozen creek with a bundle of evidence under her arm, which was not ideal. But she was going to walk in. That was not a question anymore. The gray light had gone from pale to something that almost resembled morning by the time Mabel and Bram reached the edge of town, and the cold had moved past uncomfortable into the territory where it became personal, where it stopped being weather, and started feeling like something that had a specific opinion about you. Mabel's knee was worse than she'd admitted. She'd gone down hard on the ice during the creek crossing. And while nothing was broken, she was reasonably certain. Nothing was broken, the joint had swelled inside her boot enough that every step came with a specific, unhelpful protest from the surrounding tissue. She didn't mention it. There was nothing to be done about it before she got where she needed to be, and talking about it would not improve either the knee or the situation. Bram had noticed. She could tell by the way he'd adjusted his pace, without commenting on it slowing slightly, choosing the flatter side of the track when it forked. The same way you'd adjust a route for a horse that was favoring a leg without making a production of it. She found she didn't resent it the way she usually resented people, accommodating her physical limits as though they were moral failures. He wasn't performing consideration. He was just being practical. The town was beginning to stir. Smoke from chimneys, a dog crossing between buildings, a man in a blacksmith's apron already at work, despite the hour, the sound of iron on iron carrying clearly in the cold air. Nobody paid particular attention to two people walking in from the north track, which was both reassuring and probably temporary. "Silas will know we didn't stay at the cabin," Mabel said. "He'll know by now," Bram agreed. His men would have waited a while, and then gone back to report, which means Silas knows, which means Vane knows. How much time before they organize something? Bram considered this seriously. An hour, maybe a little more. Vane doesn't like moving without preparation. That's actually one of the reasons I've had as long as I've had. He doesn't move fast when he can move carefully. He paused. But careful ran out last night when his men found the cabin empty. He'll be pushing harder this morning. Then we need to be at the recorder's office when it opens, Mabel said, and we need to move fast once we're inside. There's something you need to know about the recorder, Bram said. His name is Arthur Fenwick. He's been in the job for 3 years. He's not Vane's man in any direct sense. He hasn't taken money that I can document. But he's cautious. He doesn't like conflict. He'll try to slow things down if there's any appearance of dispute. How does he feel about a woman filing a property claim? Bram was quiet for a half-second too long. I see, Mabel said. So he's cautious and he's traditional. He's not a bad man, Bram said carefully. He just operates on the assumption that anything unusual is probably a problem. A woman who knows territorial property code walking in with documented evidence of fraud is certainly unusual, Mabel said. I'll take that. Unusual is better than ignorable. She shifted the oilskin packet under her arm, her good arm, the one without the bruise, and kept walking. They got to the recorder's office 12 minutes before it was scheduled to open, which meant they stood on the board sidewalk in the cold for 12 minutes while Mabel reviewed in her mind exactly what she intended to do and in what order. Bram stood nearby. He'd bought 2 biscuits from the bakery that had just opened its shutters plain, slightly too dense, clearly yesterday's batch warmed over, and he handed her one without preamble. She ate it because she hadn't eaten since early the day before, and operating on empty was a luxury that only the unoccupied could afford. What was your brother like? She asked, because they were waiting, and because she found she wanted to know. Bram took a moment with the question. Funny, he said finally. Not in the way that made you laugh immediately, in the slow way, where you'd be going about your business an hour later, and something he said would catch up to you, and you'd realize it was genuinely funny. He was terrible at keeping his books. He stopped. He kept asking me to help him with them. I kept telling him he needed to learn it himself. He looked at the recorder's office door. I regret that now. Mabel didn't say anything consoling. She didn't have anything consoling that would be true enough to be worth saying. He sounds like he was good company, she said. He was the best company I ever had, Bram said. And I'm not going to let the man who killed him keep his land. The recorder's office door opened from the inside at 8:05. Arthur Fenwick, unlocking it from within and pushing it open with the air of a man who had arrived late and had decided to respond to that fact with dignity rather than apology. He was a small, tidy man in his 50s, with the careful grooming of someone who took his own presentation seriously. He looked at Bram, registered something recognition, mild wariness, and then looked at Mabel with the particular expression of a man who was trying to understand what category she fell into before deciding how to address her. We're here to file a property deed, Mabel said before he could land on a category, and I'll need access to 18 months of recorded public filings. She stepped past him into the office, not rudely, but with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has every legal right to be where she's going. I'm Mabel Whitlock. My father was James Whitlock of Jefferson City, Missouri. I am the legal heir to 40 acres in the Southern Corridor that were recorded in the Missouri Territorial Office in 1861 and need to be cross-registered here. Fenwick blinked. He looked at Bram again. Miss Whitlock came in on yesterday's coach, Bram said with a mildness that was doing a lot of work. She's had a difficult arrival. She'd appreciate getting her filing in order. Mrs. Whitlock, Mabel said crisply. I'm a widow. She set the oilskin packet on the counter and began unwrapping it. I have the original deed, my father's death certificate, the letter of inheritance, and my marriage and widowhood certificates establishing my legal identity as his heir. I believe you'll find everything in order. Fenwick came to the counter. He examined the documents she produced with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his job was verification, which was to his credit. He took several minutes with the original deed, checking dates and signatures and territorial seals. Mabel waited without fidgeting, her hands flat on the counter. This appears to be in order, Fenwick said finally, in the slightly reluctant tone of a man who had been hoping to find a reason to delay things and hadn't found one. I'm glad to hear it, Mabel said. I'd like to file it and receive the registration number today. I'll need to. The territorial filing code requires same-day processing for original deed registrations presented with complete documentation, Mabel said. Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the 1868 Territorial Property Act. She paused. I'm happy to wait while you look it up if you'd like to confirm. Fenwick looked at her. Then he went to his filing cabinet. Process took 40 minutes. During that time, two things happened. First, a man Mabel hadn't seen before came in from the back office young, 20 or so, with the look of a clerk rather than an official, who took one look at what Mabel was doing at the counter and disappeared back through the door he'd come from with slightly too much urgency. Mabel noted this without changing her expression. She figured she had 20 minutes before whoever he'd gone to tell received the information and could respond to it. Second, a woman pushed open the front door, looked at Bram, and said, I heard she came back with you, in the tone of someone who has information and is trying to decide how public to be about having it. She was around 50, heavyset herself, with a face that had done a lot of hard weather, and was matter-of-fact about it. She was looking at Mabel with an expression that was assessing rather than friendly, but not hostile either. This is Lenora Pike, Bram said to Mabel. She runs the inn on the north end. Mabel looked at the woman. Did you hear anything else? She asked. Or just that I came back with him? Lenora's mouth did something that might have been the beginning of a smile. I heard that Silas Ketchum's men spent half the night looking for you and came back empty, she said. I heard that Silas woke Thaddeus Vane up before 6 this morning, which is something Vane strongly dislikes. And I heard, she stopped. I heard that you told Silas Ketchum, in front of about 15 people, that you never belonged to him. That's accurate, Mabel said. Lenora looked at her for another moment. Then she stepped inside and let the door close behind her. You need witnesses, she said, for whatever you're doing. I need something more than witnesses, Mabel said. I need people who are willing to do more than watch. That's a different conversation, Lenora said, but it's not one I'm unwilling to have. Fenwick returned from his filing cabinet with the registration form, and Mabel turned back to the counter. Her deed was registered. She had a number. The 40 acres were, for the first time, officially in the territorial record under her name, which meant anyone who wanted to challenge them would have to do so publicly, with documents, in front of a recorder who had now seen them and processed them and could not unsee or unprocess that fact. It was a small thing, but small things done correctly were the architecture of large things. Now Mabel said, I'd like to see the public property filings. 18 months. Fenwick opened his mouth. They're public record, Mabel said. Also Section 14. I can wait while you locate them if you need to. He went and found them. She worked for 2 hours at the counter, standing the whole time because there was nowhere to sit that would give her an angle on the documents. And the knee objected to standing, but she managed the objection by focusing very precisely on what she was reading. Bram stood at the end of the counter, watching the door. Lenora sat in the one chair by the wall and didn't leave. The errors were everywhere. Mabel had suspected, from the documents Bram had collected, that the fraud was sloppier than it appeared at a glance. She had not suspected it was this sloppy. These were not the mistakes of someone who had been careful and made occasional errors. These were the mistakes of someone
who had been confident, overconfident, that nobody with the specific knowledge required to identify them would ever look at these records with that knowledge in hand.
The notary stamp issue she'd identified the night before was real and provable. The stamp number on a series of transfers from the previous year predated the stamp's issuance by the territorial office by 11 weeks. She wrote down the stamp number, the document numbers, the dates. She found the same witness appearing on documents from 3 different locations on the same day. She found property descriptions that had been altered. She could see the alterations, if you knew what you were looking for. The ink slightly different. The handwriting slightly different in those specific sections. The surrounding text consistent, but the altered portions betraying themselves to anyone who looked at enough documents to develop an eye for the pattern. And then she found something Bram hadn't found. Something that went beyond the individual property transfers he'd been tracking. 3 companies, different names, different registered agents, had filed land claims in the county over the past 18 months. All 3 were recording the same address in their filings. Post office box in Denver. And all 3, she could see from the pattern of witnesses and notaries and the specific language of their deed descriptions, had been processed by the same pair of hands. She looked up. "Bram," she said. He came to the counter. She showed him what she'd found without explaining it first, letting him look at it himself. She watched his face as he worked through it. "That's not 3 companies," he said. "No," Mabel said. "It's one operation filing under 3 names. Which means the total acreage Vane has acquired isn't what you calculated. It's about 3 times that. And the legal exposure is also 3 times what you were looking at, because filing false corporate declarations in territorial land claims is a federal offense, not just a territorial one." She straightened. "We need to file challenges against every transfer connected to these 3 companies. Today, before anyone understands what we've found." "How many transfers?" Mabel looked at her notes. 11 that I can document clearly enough to challenge with what's here. There may be more, but 11 is enough to create a problem for Thaddeus Vane that he cannot quietly make go away. She paused. The federal element is important. It takes it out of the territorial court system entirely, which is where he has his connections. Bram stared at the documents. She could see him processing the implications. "You said people were afraid to testify," Mabel said. "Testimony isn't what's going to break this. Documentation is. Testimony helps. But if the paper evidence is strong enough, the case doesn't rest on whether frightened people are willing to stand in front of Vane and say what they know." She looked at him straight. He built this on fear. But he forgot that fear works best when people are isolated, when they're alone with it. He didn't plan for someone to connect all the pieces together in one place. Fenwick had retreated to the far end of his office and was doing something with papers that was almost certainly not actual work. Lenora was watching Mabel from her chair, with an expression that had moved from assessing to something else. The front door opened. Mabel had been expecting this. The young clerk, who disappeared out the back half an hour ago, had clearly gone to report, and this was the response. The man who came in was not Silas. Silas, she was beginning to understand, was sent to handle things that were expected to be manageable. This man was different, older, dressed more carefully, with the particular manner of someone who was accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. He had graying hair and a good coat, and the kind of stillness that powerful men sometimes cultivated as a substitute for genuine calm. Thaddeus Vane looked at Bram first to be acknowledgement, nothing more, and then looked at Mabel. She looked back. She'd been looked at that way before. Not specifically by him, but by men like him, men who had decided, somewhere between the door and the counter, that whatever she was doing was something they could interrupt and redirect, because she was a woman with bruises on her face and a carpet bag and no local standing, and men like Thaddeus Vane were very good at calculating leverage. What he calculated incorrectly was that she had none. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. Smooth, recognizing that knowing her name would signal something. "I understand you had a difficult arrival yesterday. Sorry for that." Silas can be careless. He came to the counter. He didn't acknowledge the document spread across it. "I'd like to speak with you about your property situation." "I've already handled my property situation," Mabel said. "My deed is registered. You can verify that with Mr. Fenwick." A small pause. He recovered quickly, of course. "And I think that's wise. What I'd like to discuss is a more advantageous arrangement for you, going forward." Your 40 acres are in an area that's going to become very difficult to manage independently over the next few years. There are several interests competing for that corridor in Minot's. I'm not selling, Mabel said. I haven't made an offer yet. Mr. Vane. She said his name with the same matter-of-fact energy she'd used on Fenwick's filing code. I know who you are. I know what you've been doing in this county for the past 2 years. And I know that your approach to property acquisition changes depending on whether the person you're talking to knows what I know. She held his gaze. So we can skip the portion of this conversation where you make me an offer. And I'm supposed to be surprised by how generous it is, and we can get to the part where you decide what to do next. The room was very quiet. Thaddeus Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite a drop in the temperature, but was adjacent to it. You're in a difficult position, he said. His voice had changed register. Still controlled, but the performance of concern was gone. You're alone in a county you don't know. You have no money of significance, no local connections, and you've just made an enemy of the man who was supposed to provide your housing. Whatever Bram Calloway has told you about me, I'd suggest you consider the difference between a man with documented resources and legal standing and a man with, he glanced at Bram, grudge. And I'd suggest, Mabel said, that you look at what's on this counter before you finish that sentence. He looked down at the documents. She watched his eyes move across them. She watched the moment he understood what he was looking at, not the specific details, necessarily, but the volume of it. Organized, annotated, cross-referenced volume of it. That stamp number predates its own issuance by 11 weeks, Mabel said, pointing to the relevant document. That witness was apparently in 3 places at once. Those 3 companies you've been filing under share an address and a pair of hands. I've identified 11 transfers I can challenge today with what's here, and I suspect there are more. She paused. Mr. Vane, these records have been sitting in this office for 2 years. They just needed someone to look at them who knew what they were looking at. Straightened. His face had gone to something composed and distant, the expression of a man who was doing rapid calculations behind a controlled surface. You'll find litigation expensive, he said. I expect I will, Mabel said. But federal land fraud doesn't have to go through territorial court. I suspect you know that already. A very long pause. You're making a significant mistake, he said finally. I filed my challenges, Mabel said. Mr. Fenwick has stamped them. The public record now shows 11 disputed transfers. That can't be undisputed without a hearing. She gathered her notes, calmly, methodically. If you'd like to discuss a resolution that doesn't end with a federal investigation into 3 fraudulent corporate filings, you're welcome to contact me through Mr. Calloway. Otherwise, I'll expect to hear from the court. Thaddeus Vane looked at her for a moment longer. She expected him to say something else, to make another approach, to shift the angle of attack. He was a man who didn't run out of angles quickly. But something in the stillness of Mabel's posture, and perhaps something in the organized stack of documents she was now wrapping back into its oilskin, communicated something that she suspected he hadn't encountered recently enough to have a prepared response to. He left. The door closed behind him. The room held its breath. Then Lenora Pike said, from her chair by the wall, well. Mabel turned to look at her. Lenora's expression had arrived at something that was clearly respect and was trying to figure out how to arrange itself on her face. He's going to come back, Bram said. He wasn't alarmed by this fact. He was just stating it the way you state weather. I know, Mabel said, but not here, not today. He's going to reassess and organize and come back with a different approach. She looked down at her notes, which means we have today to do the rest of what needs doing. What's the rest? Lenora asked. Mabel looked at her. You said you weren't unwilling to have a different conversation. I think it's time to have it. She paused. I need to reach the families whose land is in those challenged transfers, the ones who are still here. I need them to understand that they're not alone in this anymore, and that what was done to them is documented, and that there is a path forward that doesn't require each of them to stand up alone in front of a man they're afraid of. She looked at Lenora. You know this town. You know who those people are and whether they'll listen. Lenora considered this. It was a real consideration. She wasn't performing reluctance. She was actually weighing something. There are some who won't, Lenora said finally. Fears had a long time to set in some of these people. You're not going to reach everyone. She paused. But there are a few. Dora Hatch, The Paulson family, they're still fighting the legal claim on their east pasture. And there's a man named Greer who lost his water rights in the first round and has been furious about it for a year, but doesn't know what to do with the fury. She stopped. I can reach them. I can get them to my inn tonight if you can tell me what you need from them. I need them to understand what happened to them, Mabel said. Specifically, the documents, the evidence, the mechanism. Not in general terms specifically. So they can make an informed decision about whether to participate in a formal challenge with what they know and what I've documented, rather than standing alone on what they believe. She paused. Can you do that? I can get them there, Lenora said. What you do with them once I have them, that's on you. Fair enough, Mabel said. She looked at Bram. He was watching her with the expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one where he was thinking something he was going to say in a moment when he'd finished thinking it properly. What? She said. I've been working on this for 6 months, he said. I couldn't get those people in a room together. I couldn't even get them to return my visit. You asked them to trust a man with a grievance, Mabel said, not unkindly. I'm asking Lenora to bring them to a place they already trust, to hear information they need, regardless of what they decide to do with it. She picked up her bag. Also, I suspect Dora Hatch might prefer to hear this from someone who has also recently survived a man grabbing her arm in public. Bram was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You need to eat something before tonight, and you need to get off that knee for a few hours. I also need the Paulson deed description and whatever you have on the Greer water rights transaction, Mabel said, because I want to be able to explain exactly what happened to those specific properties in terms those families will recognize, and I need to prepare that before tonight. You can do all of that at the inn, Lenora said, standing. I have a back room with a table and a chair that doesn't wobble, and I made soup this morning. She looked at Mabel's knee in the assessing way of a woman who had correctly identified a problem she wasn't going to be thanked for pointing out directly. You can work at the table with your leg up. Mabel looked at her. Thank you, she said. Yes, thank you. They walked to the inn through the mid-morning cold, Bram on her left again, Lenora on her right. The town was fully awake now, people moving on the street, a wagon loading outside the hardware store. Several people looked at them. A few of the looks had the quality of people who had heard something and were trying to reconcile what they'd heard with what they were seeing. Mabel kept her back straight and her face forward. The knee protested every step. She managed it. Inside the inn, Lenora set her up at the back room table exactly as promised and brought soup that turned out to be genuinely good beans and salt pork and something that might have been a parsnip, warmer than the cabin and substantially more sustaining than yesterday's biscuit. Bram spread documents on the table, and they worked through the afternoon, building the specific case histories for the Paulson land, the Greer water rights, the Hatch property, the exact sequence of events, the documents involved, the errors that proved fraudulent intent. Around 3 in the afternoon, Mabel looked up from a transfer document and said, Everett's signature. Bram across the table looked up. On the deed transfer for his property. You said it was supposedly his signature. She turned the document toward him. Did you ever see his actual signature on any legitimate document? Bram stared at her. His property tax filings, he said slowly. I have copies. I got them from the territorial record when I was first collecting evidence. Get them, Mabel said. He found them in the oilskin packets, the tax filings. 3 years of them, each with Everett Calloway's recorded signature. She laid them beside the deed transfer and held a lamp close and looked at them without speaking for a long time. The signatures were different. Not dramatically different. Whoever had forged the deed transfer signature had done their work carefully enough that a casual inspection would miss it. But the pen pressure was wrong. The particular way Everett Calloway apparently formed his capital E, a distinctive small loop at the top that appeared in all 3 tax filings, was absent from the deed transfer. The deed transfer signature had been copied from something, probably another document with his signature, and it had been copied well enough to pass. But it hadn't been copied by someone who understood how Everett Calloway actually held a pen. This is forgery, Mabel said. Provable forgery, if we can get someone qualified to examine it alongside the tax records. Bram looked at the documents for a long time. Something moved in his face, not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something that was grief and fury, and something almost like relief, which was the particular combination of feelings that came when a thing you had known was true was finally standing in front of you as something you could prove. We need this in front of the marshal, Mabel said, gently, before anyone has a chance to interfere with those records. I know, Bram said. I know. He stopped. He looked at her across the table. How are you doing this? Doing what? Yesterday you stepped off a stagecoach after 11 days of travel, and a man grabbed you in the street, and you spent the night crossing a frozen creek with evidence under your arm. Today you filed a deed, challenged 11 property transfers, faced down Thaddeus Vane, and spent 6 hours rebuilding a fraud case from scratch. He paused. Most people would be falling apart, Mabel said. Something like that. She considered this honestly. I have been frightened the entire time, she said. That helps. I'm frightened right now. The difference is that being frightened and doing nothing produces the same outcome as whatever Silas and Vane intended, and that outcome is unacceptable to me. She looked back at the documents. So I'm frightened and doing something anyway, and I'll fall apart later when there's time for it. Bram was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say about courage in a long time. It's not courage, Mabel said. Courage makes it sound like you're not scared. I'm very scared. It's more like she stopped, searching for the right word. Stubbornness, maybe. I came too far to be stopped by a man who thinks I'm too ashamed of my own body to fight back. The afternoon light moved across the table. Outside, Lenora was beginning to move around the inn with the particular purposeful energy of someone preparing for something, and Mabel could hear voices, now and then Lenora speaking to someone, words not audible but tone clear, and she understood that the evening was being arranged. Bram found the Greer water rights documents, and they worked until the lamp was necessary, and by the time the first knock came at the inn's front door, Mabel had 3 clear, specific, documentable case histories that she could explain to someone with no legal knowledge in terms that would make the mechanism of what had been done to them entirely visible. She heard the knock, and then voices, and then footsteps, and she straightened her papers in her back simultaneously and looked at Bram. Ready? He said. No, Mabel said, but that's never stopped me yet. She picked up her notes and walked out to meet them. The room Lenora used for town gatherings was at the back of the inn, separated from the main dining area by a heavy curtain that did a reasonable job of muffling sound when it needed to. It held about 20 people comfortably, and perhaps 30 if nobody was particular about comfort. When Mabel walked out from the back workroom with her notes under her arm, there were 9 people already seated, 7 adults, and 2 children who had apparently refused to be left elsewhere. Plus, Lenora standing near the door with the expression of a woman who has accomplished exactly what she said she would accomplish, and is waiting for someone else to carry the next part. Mabel looked at the faces in the room and understood immediately that Lenora had been right. Some of these people were going to be hard to reach. She could see it in the way they were sitting, not the loose, curious arrangement of people who wanted to hear something, but the careful, guarded posture of people who had learned that wanting things was expensive. A woman near the far wall with work-ruined hands and a jaw set like a closed door that would be Dora Hatch. 2 men together who kept glancing at each other as if checking whether the other one was about to leave, probably the Paulson brothers. An older man alone, sitting slightly apart from the others, with the particular fury of someone who has been angry about something for a long time and has begun to turn the anger inward for lack of anywhere else to put it. Greer, most likely. There were also 4 people she hadn't expected, a young woman with a baby, a middle-aged man in a merchant's vest, an elderly couple who appeared to have come together and were holding hands on the bench between them. Lenora had reached further than the 3 specific families. Mabel set her notes on the table at the front of the room. She didn't organize herself elaborately or wait for everyone to settle. Waiting for rooms to settle was something that worked when people wanted to be there, and several people in this room were visibly calculating the cost of being here at all. I'm Mabel Whitlock, she said. I got off the stagecoach yesterday. I don't have history in this town and I don't have local standing, and I'm aware that's a reason to be skeptical of me. I'm not going to ask you to trust me. She looked around the room. What I'm going to do is show you documents, public records, things that have been sitting in the county recorder's office for 2 years. And then I'm going to explain what those documents mean, and after that what you do is entirely up to you. Pause. Nobody left. That was something. She started with Dora Hatch. Not because Dora was the easiest, she was clearly. Not the easiest, but because her situation was the most recent and the most immediately precarious. And Mabel had learned from 4 years behind a land office counter that people who are in immediate danger pay attention in a different way than people who are processing something that already happened to them. Dora's property was still in dispute. Her deed challenge was still pending. The outcome was not yet fixed. "Mrs. Hatch," Mabel said, "your deed was filed in '64 under your husband's name. When your husband died, the property passed to you as surviving spouse under Territorial Inheritance Code. There's no dispute there. The law is clear. But 6 months after your husband's death, a land transfer document appeared in the county record claiming your husband had sold the eastern 15 acres to a company called Harlan Land and Mineral before he died." Dora Hatch's jaw, which had already been set, got harder. "My husband never signed anything like that." "I know," Mabel said. "I know because the notary stamp on that document, I have the document number here. You can verify it yourself. At the recorder's office bears a stamp number that was not issued by the territorial notary office until 11 weeks after the date on the document." She placed the relevant paper on the table. Whoever prepared that transfer either made a significant error or was working from fraudulent materials prepared in advance. Either way, the document itself is invalid on its face, and the transfer records cannot be legally enforced. Dora stared at the paper. She didn't reach for it immediately. Mabel waited. "That's the thing they've been using in the legal proceeding," Dora said finally. "That's the document they keep citing." "Yes," Mabel said. "And I'll tell you something important about that. A document that is fraudulent doesn't become valid because it's been cited in a proceeding. What you need is for someone with legal standing to formally challenge it in front of the court with the notary records as counter-evidence." She paused. "I filed that kind of challenge today. Not on your property specifically. I don't have direct standing on your property. But I filed it on 11 transfers connected to the same operation, including documents that use the same stamp and the same fraudulent notary. If those challenges are heard together, the stamp issue becomes a pattern, not an isolated error. Patterns are harder to explain away." Dora was quiet for a moment. Her hands on her knees were not quite steady. "Who would bring that challenge?" she said. "The territorial marshal has jurisdiction over federal land fraud," Mabel said. "I've sent word this afternoon, requesting his presence in Coldwater Ridge. What he finds when he gets here will determine what happens next. The more documented evidence of pattern he finds, not just one disputed deed, but the same fraudulent mechanism applied across multiple properties, the harder it becomes to treat this as a series of isolated civil disputes." "Vane has lawyers," the older man said from the side of the room. "Greer." He said it with the particular flashness of someone who had already tried an avenue and been turned back by it. "Good lawyers. Territorial court lawyers. I went to the court in '69 about my water rights, and his lawyers had 3 continuances granted before I ran out of money to keep the thing going." "He does have lawyers," Mabel said. "And those lawyers are very good at territorial court proceedings, where judges have wide discretion, where continuances can be granted, and where the cost of staying in the fight is the primary weapon." She looked at Greer directly. "That's not the jurisdiction we're operating in. Federal land fraud involving corporate declaration violations goes to federal court, where the rules about continuances are different and where territorial political connections are less relevant." She paused. "The water rights transfer on your property, I looked at it this afternoon. The company that filed the claim against your rights is one of 3 companies I've identified as operating from the same address, under the same hands. That's a federal issue, not a territorial one." Something moved in Greer's face. Particular movement of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long, he stopped believing there's any surface to set it on. "You can't know that for certain, just from an address," he said. But his voice had shifted slightly from the flatness it had started with. "I can cross-reference the filing agents, the notaries, the witness signatures, and the deed description language," Mabel said. "I spent this afternoon doing it. Would you like to see the comparison?" She didn't wait for him to say yes. She put the 3 company filings side by side on the table and walked him through it, the same agent signature appearing under different company names, the same characteristic phrasing in the deed descriptions, the same 2 notaries appearing across all 3 companies' filings, the Denver address used consistently. She was aware as she talked that the room had gotten very quiet, and that other people were leaning toward the Paulson brothers, the man in the merchant's vest, the elderly couple. Greer got up from his bench and came to look at the documents himself. He stood there for a long time, bent over the table. "It's the same handwriting," he said finally, pointing to 2 different company filings. "The agent's signatures. That's the same person writing 2 different names." "Yes," Mabel said. He straightened. He looked at Bram, who had been standing near the wall since they'd come in. Then he looked back at Mabel. Something had changed in his face. The inward-turned fury had shifted direction. "What do you need from me?" he said. Mabel opened her mouth to answer, and the door opened. Not Lenora. Lenora was already in the room. It was the young man who worked at the stables near the north end of town, and he was out of breath in the way of someone who had run more than walked to get there. He looked at Bram. "Silas's men," he said, getting the words out between breaths. 4 of them. "They're at the depot. They've been asking around about who's been at the recorder's office today and who went into the inn this evening." The room reacted. Not panic, it was not quite that, but the kind of charged stillness that preceded either panic or decision, and Mabel could see in the faces of the people around her the exact moment when some of them started calculating exits. "Silas asking questions is not illegal," Mabel said, loudly enough that it cut through the beginning of that calculation. "He can ask every person in this town what they had for breakfast, and that is fully within his rights. What matters is that we are also within our rights to be in this room with these documents, having this conversation." She looked around at the faces. "The moment you leave because he is asking questions is the moment he has accomplished something without doing anything. He's not in this room. He cannot hear what we're saying. He does not know specifically who is here or what is being discussed, and that is exactly the situation we need to maintain." Pause. A couple of people who had started to shift resettled. The young man from the stable was still standing in the doorway. Lenora moved to him and said something quietly that Mabel couldn't hear, and he nodded and left, and Lenora closed the door. "You're not wrong that he's outside," Lenora said to the room. She said it plainly, with the authority of someone who had run the only decent inn in a 40-mile radius for 12 years, and had therefore earned a particular kind of standing. "He's been outside before. He's been making things difficult in this town for 2 years. She paused. "What's different tonight is that someone who knows how to take this apart is sitting right there." She nodded at Mabel. "I suggest we let her finish. Nobody left." Mabel breathed. Then she went back to the documents. She took each family through their specific situation. The Paulson brothers, whose East Pasture deed transfer she'd identified as using a backdated date that contradicted their own tax filing records. The young woman with the baby, who it turned out had a claim on a small piece of land her father had left her that had somehow ended up in one of Vane's company filings without any transfer document she'd ever been shown. The merchant, whose water access easement had been challenged by a land claim that used the same fraudulent stamp as Dora Hatch's transfer. She was specific. She used document numbers. She put the papers on the table where people could look at them. She didn't tell anyone what to do with the information. She explained what the information was and let the understanding of it do its own work. It took 2 hours. Her knee, by the end, was telling her things she didn't want to hear. She'd been standing since they started, because sitting felt like a concession she couldn't afford in front of people who were deciding whether she was serious. She was very serious. Her knee would have to negotiate with that fact. When she'd finished going through the last document, the elderly couple's situation, a homestead claim that had been partially absorbed by one of Vane's companies through a deed description manipulation, so technically sophisticated that it had taken her nearly an hour that afternoon to fully reconstruct it. She straightened her papers and looked at the room. "I'm going to tell you what I told Thaddeus Vane this morning," she said. "This is not complicated. At the core, the complications are in the details, and I know the details, and the details are on our side. What makes this hard is not the law and it's not the evidence. What makes it hard is that he has spent 2 years making certain each of you was alone with your problem." She paused. "When you're alone with something like this, it feels bigger than it is. Feels permanent. You start thinking that the way things are now is the way they have to be, because you can't see a path through it from inside the place he's put you." The room was very still. "You're not alone in it tonight," Mabel said. "Every person in this room has a piece of the same problem, and every piece corroborates every other piece. That is what changes the calculation." Dora Hatch said, "What happens if Vane retaliates before the marshal gets here?" It was a fair question. Mabel had been expecting it. "He will try something," Mabel said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He's not going to sit still. What he won't be able to do is put evidence back in boxes once it's been filed and stamped and corroborated. He can make things uncomfortable. He can try to discredit me, and he will try to discredit me, because I'm the easiest target. I'm new here and nobody knows me. And there's a version of this where he tells people, I'm a grifter who showed up with forged documents and confused a bunch of frightened people. She looked around. The defense against that is that you know what you saw here tonight. You can read your own deed descriptions. You can verify the stamp numbers yourselves at the recorder's office tomorrow morning. The public record is the public record. He can claim I'm lying, but he can't change what's in those files. The older of the two Paulson brothers, a man of about 50, with a weathered face and calloused hands, said, I want to put my name on the challenge. Whatever you're filing, I want my name on it. His brother looked at him. We've been waiting 2 years, the older one said to his brother, not sharply with the weight of someone who has made a decision after a long private internal argument. I'm done waiting. A pause. Then the younger brother nodded. Greer said, same. Mabel looked at Dora Hatch. Dora was quiet for a moment that stretched. Her jaw was still set, but there was something moving behind her eyes, the particular movement of a person working through the last calculation between an old fear and a new one. If I sign something tonight, Dora said, and the marshal doesn't come, send for me, Mabel said. Whatever happens, you send for me. I will not leave you holding this alone. She met Dora's eyes directly. That's a promise. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. Another pause. Then Dora said, where do I sign? Mabel spent the next hour taking statements, not formal depositions, which required a notary and specific procedural steps, but written accounts in each person's own words of what had happened to their property, signed and dated, witnessed by Lenora and by each other. It was not a legal proceeding. It was a record. It was the beginning of a record that, added to the documentary evidence she'd filed that day, would give the federal marshal something concrete to work with when he arrived. Lenora, who turned out to have been a school teacher for 8 years before she'd run the inn, wrote clearly and quickly and organized the witness signatures with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing paperwork involving large groups of reluctant people. Bram stood near the door the entire time, watching the street through the small window, and 3 times came to quietly tell Mabel that Silas's men were still outside and hadn't moved any closer. She acknowledged this each time without changing what she was doing. They were almost done. The elderly couple was the last. The husband's hand shaking slightly as he signed his name, but his face determined in the way of old men who have decided that dignity requires the thing to be done regardless of the physical difficulty. When the door opened for the second time that evening, this time it wasn't a stable hand. Silas Ketchum came in alone, which surprised Mabel slightly. She'd expected him to bring men with him to make a show of force. Instead, he came in alone, without his hat, which she found she read as a signal of something she wasn't sure what yet. He looked at the room. He looked at the statements on the table. He looked at Mabel. The faces in the room looked back at him with varying degrees of expression, Greer with open anger, Dora with something harder than anger, Paulson brothers with the careful blankness of men who have been in rooms where things could go wrong and have learned to manage their faces in those rooms. You need to stop this, Silas said. He was talking to Mabel, but he was looking at the room. Whatever she's told you, whatever she's this is not what it looks like. What does it look like? Mabel said. He didn't answer that. She doesn't know this county. She doesn't know who Thaddeus Vane is or what he can do. She's been here 2 days, and she's walked into something she doesn't understand, and she's dragging all of you into it with her. She showed us our own deeds, the older Paulson said. Our own records. You want to tell me she's lying about what's in our own records? Silas turned to him. There are legal complexities. There's a notary stamp that didn't exist yet, Greer said, on a document with my name in it. That's not a complexity. That's a lie on a legal document. Silas's face was doing something complicated. Mabel watched it. She'd seen that expression before, not often, but she recognized it. It was the expression of a man who had been the instrument of someone else's plan for long enough that he'd stopped examining whether the plan was one he'd have chosen for himself, and who was now, for the first time in a while, in a room where the plan's consequences were visible and specific and had names attached to them. Silas, Mabel said. Not gently. She wasn't performing gentleness. She didn't have the energy for it, and he wouldn't have believed it anyway, but without the edge, she might have used another hour of this. You didn't write those letters. Whoever wrote them knew enough about land office work to construct something plausible, and that's not you. You're not a forger, and you're not a fraud architect. You're a man who does what a wealthier man tells him to do and tries not to think too hard about the mechanism. She paused. Which means, when this comes apart, and it is coming apart, you're the visible layer. You're what the investigation sees first. Vane is careful. His name doesn't appear directly on most of the documents. Yours does. The room was absolutely still. Silas looked at her. What are you saying? I'm saying that a man who provides information and cooperation in a federal investigation is treated very differently than a man who doesn't, Mabel said. I'm not a lawyer. I can't make you any promises. But I know how these proceedings work, and I know that the person who comes forward first with a complete account is not the same category of problem as the person who waits until there's no other option. She held his gaze. The marshal hasn't arrived yet. You still have a choice that's actually a choice. The silence stretched. Silas looked at the faces in the room. He looked at Dora Hatch, who looked back at him without any softness whatsoever. He looked at Greer. He looked at the signed statements on the table. Then he said, very quietly, I never knew about Everett Calloway. Bram, who had been standing near the wall and saying nothing for the past 2 hours, went very still. What do you mean you never knew? Bram said. His voice was level with the kind of effort that levelness requires. I mean, Vane handled that himself. He didn't tell me what he was going to do. He told me afterward, and by then, Silas stopped. He looked at the floor. By then, I was already far enough in that I didn't see a way out. The room took a collective breath that wasn't quite a sound. Sit down, Mabel said to Silas. It wasn't a request and it wasn't a command. It was the tone of someone managing a situation that had just changed shape and needed to be handled carefully. We're going to go through what you know. Everything. Starting from the beginning. Silas sat down. Lenora, without being asked, produced another sheet of paper. They were an hour into Silas's account. He was careful and frightened, and kept stopping to revise things before saying them. Slowed things down drone, but also meant that what he did say was more likely to be accurate when Bram came to Mabel's shoulder and said quietly, close to her ear, man outside just moved. He went east, not back to the depot. Toward Vane's office, Mabel said. Yes. She thought about this for a moment. How long before Vane can get people here? 20 minutes. Maybe less. She turned back to Silas. We need to speed this up. What is the most direct connection between Vane and the intimidation campaign? The specific acts, not the property transactions. I have those. Threats. The accidents. Silas looked at her. He was not a good man. She was not confused about that. But he was a man who was in the process of understanding that the structure he'd attached himself to was collapsing, and men in that position occasionally became useful in specific ways. There's a man named Doyle, Silas said. He worked directly for Vane. Not through me. He handled the situations that required a different approach. He stopped. I can tell you where he operates. I can tell you the account where Vane paid him, because I saw a ledger once that I wasn't supposed to see. He paused. And I can tell you what Vane said to me the week after Everett Calloway died. Say it exactly, Mabel said. Word for word as close as you can get. Silas said it. Lenora wrote it down. Mabel had him repeat it, corrected the transcription at one point, and had Lenora read it back so Silas could confirm the accuracy. Then she had Silas sign the statement. She had Lenora notarize it. She had the Paulson brothers, Greer, and Dora Hatch sign as witnesses. The whole process took 11 minutes. 12 minutes later, there was a noise from the street outside, not violent, not immediately threatening, but the specific sound of several people arriving with a purposeful rather than casual quality. Bram moved to the window. 4 men, he said, Vane's people, not Silas's. He looked at Mabel. Vane himself isn't with them. He won't come himself, Mabel said. Not tonight. Tonight he sends men to manage the situation, and tomorrow he reassesses. She looked around the room, the families. Silas sitting with his signed statement in front of him, Lenora standing with her notary materials, Bram at the window. Nobody leaves through the front door right now. Lenora, is there a back way out for people who need to get home? Through the kitchen and the yard, Lenora said. I'll take them. Good. Mabel looked at the families. Go home. Keep your signed copies of your statements. Do not speak to anyone who comes to your property tonight. Not Silas's men. Not Vane's men. Not anyone who shows up after dark asking questions. You are not required to open your door to anyone who doesn't have legal authority, and legal authority looks like a federal marshal's badge, not a hired man with a hard expression. She paused. The documents are filed. The record exists. They cannot undo that. People began to move. Lenora shepherded them toward the kitchen with the calm efficiency of a woman who had managed difficult situations in small spaces before. Dora Hatch stopped beside Mabel on her way past. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then my husband's name was Franklin. He built that house himself. She paused. I want his name on whatever comes out of this. Not just mine. His. I'll make sure of it, Mabel said. Dora nodded once and followed the others. Bram had not moved from the window. They're still outside, he said. Just standing. Let them stand, Mabel said. We're not doing anything that requires darkness. She gathered the documents, the statements, Silas's signed account, her notes from the afternoon, the challenged filings, and packed them with the oilskin packets, tied them carefully. She was aware of her hands not being entirely steady, and she managed this by making the tying of the oilskin a deliberate, focused activity rather than something she tried to do fast. Silas, still sitting. What happens to me tonight? Nothing tonight, Mabel said. You go home, you do not speak to Vane. If he contacts you, you tell him you need time to think and you give him nothing. She looked at him. If you change your mind about cooperating, if between now and when the marshal gets here, you decide that loyalty to Vane is worth more than what I've explained to you, I want you to think carefully about who is in the better position. You've been the visible layer for 2 years. Vane has been careful. He will sacrifice you without hesitation to protect himself, because that is what men like him do. She picked up the oilskin bundle. The only version of this, where you come out the other side with anything, is the version where you've already told everything to someone with federal authority. Silas looked at his hands on the table. He looked like a man who had not slept well in some time, and was beginning to understand that the not sleeping was going to continue for a while yet. The letters, he said. To you in Missouri. I wrote them, but Vane told me what to say. He knew about your father's land. He'd been tracking it for over a year. A pause. I'm sorry about that. He stopped. That's a specific thing I did, and I'm sorry. Mabel looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. Tell the marshal. She walked out of the back room and through the inn's main area and into the cold of the night through the front door, which was the door the men outside were watching, because she was finished conducting her business through back windows and kitchen yards. She walked out with the oilskin packet under her arm, and her notes in her hand, and her knee hurting enough that she was aware of every step. And she stood on the board sidewalk in the dark and cold air of Coldwater Ridge, and looked at the 4 men across the street. They looked back at her. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Bram came out behind her, and they stood there together in the cold. And after another long moment, the 4 men exchanged looks and drifted apart, not quite leaving, but no longer a unified presence. That was deliberate, Bram said, the front door. Yes, Mabel said. It was also somewhat dangerous. Less dangerous than letting them think there was something here worth being secretive about, Mabel said. She looked up the street, then down it. The town was quieter now, the evening well advanced, lamplight in windows. Vane is going to move tonight. Not here, not publicly. He's going to look at what he still controls and try to protect it. What does he still control? The territorial court connections. The lawyers. Time. If he can create enough delay before the marshal arrives. She shifted the packet under her arm. Which is why I need to write to the federal land office tonight, not just the marshal. The more institutional attention this has before Vane can organize a response, the harder it becomes to quiet. Lenora has paper and ink in the back room, Bram said. Mabel looked at him. In the lamplight from the inn's window, his face was hard to read in detail, but she could see that he was tired, the specific tired, that came not from physical exertion, but from 2 years of working on something that had just shifted significantly in a single day. Your brother's land, she said. It's going to come back. I'm not promising timelines, but the forgery evidence on that signature is solid. It'll come back. Bram was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I believe you. He paused. I don't know what I'm going to do with it when it does. I've been so focused on getting it back that I haven't. He stopped. Never mind. That's a later problem. It's a good later problem to have, Mabel said. Yes, Bram said, it is. They went back inside. Lenora had already cleared the gathering room and reset it into something more like a normal sitting area, with the efficiency of a woman who understood that the less visible evidence there was of the evening's activities, the better. She had paper and ink waiting in the back room and a fresh lamp, and she'd moved the chair so it sat at an angle that would allow someone to rest a leg that wasn't behaving correctly while still reaching the table. Mabel sat down, pulled the chair into exactly the position Lenora had calculated, and picked up the pen. She wrote 4 letters that night. The Federal Land Office, the Territorial Marshal's office at 2 different addresses to ensure at least one arrived quickly, and one to a lawyer she'd worked with in Jefferson City who had experience in territorial property disputes and whose name on a filing would carry weight she couldn't yet carry herself. She wrote them carefully, without dramatics, with document numbers and specific statutory citations and a clear account of the fraudulent mechanism and the evidence available to support the challenge. She was a woman who had spent 4 years making sure the important information was in the right place in the right format, and she wrote the way she'd learned to write efficiently, precisely, without room for ambiguity. When she finished the last one and sealed it, the lamp had burned low and the inn was quiet around her, and her knee had stopped sending active protests and settled into a dull, steady ache that was at least consistent. Bram was asleep in the chair by the wall, his chin on his chest, his coat still on. He'd sat down to wait while she wrote, and had apparently lost the argument with exhaustion that she hadn't yet lost with hers. Mabel looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the letters and took them out to Lenora, who was still awake in the kitchen and who agreed, without any particular ceremony about it, to make sure all 4 were on the earliest available outbound coach. "You need to sleep," Lenora said to Mabel. "I know," Mabel said. "There's a room upstairs. It's not fancy. I've slept in a stagecoach for 11 days, Mabel said. "I have no opinions about fancy." She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she let herself be afraid for approximately 3 minutes, the full weight of it, the genuine terror of what happened if the marshal didn't come, if Vane moved faster than she'd calculated, if the documents weren't enough, if the people who'd signed tonight lost their nerve by morning. She let all of it in and felt it properly. Then she lay down and closed her eyes. She was asleep before she finished the thought she'd started. She woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of something she couldn't immediately place, a low, rhythmic sound from the street below that her sleeping mind tried to file as wind and her waking mind correctly identified as voices. Multiple voices. Outside the inn, not loud but persistent, the kind of sound that had been going on for a while before it crossed whatever threshold was required to wake her. She sat up. Her knee was stiff in the cold, and she worked it carefully before putting weight on it, bending it slowly, feeling the swollen tissue protest, and then reluctantly agree to function. It was worse than yesterday. That was the honest accounting. She stood up, put her boots on, and went to the window. There were 7 people in the street below. Not Vane's men, she could tell that immediately from the way they were standing, the lack of any organized, watchful quality that hired men carried. These were ordinary people, and they were talking to Bram, who was standing in the inn's doorway with his coat on and a cup of something in his hand. She watched for a moment, trying to read the body language. Not hostile. Something else agitated, maybe. Urgent. She was downstairs in 4 minutes. Bram looked at her when she came through the door. His expression said, "This is a development." The 7 people in the street were not the people from last night's gathering. She recognized none of them. A man of about 60 with a face like old saddle leather. 2 younger men who looked enough alike to be brothers. A woman in her 40s with the particular expression of someone who has been awake long enough that fatigue has cycled through and come out the other side into a kind of electric alertness. 2 more men and a teenage boy who looked like he'd attached himself to the group in the way that teenagers attached themselves to things that seemed important. "Mrs. Whitlock," the older man said. He had the tone of a man who had been rehearsing something. "My name is William Cord. I had 80 acres in the East Range. Had. Thaddeus Vane's company filed a competing claim against me in '69, and I lost the property when I couldn't make the legal fees." He paused. "I heard what happened yesterday. At the recorder's office. I heard about the gathering here last night." He stopped. "I should have come last night. I decided not to come. And then I couldn't sleep, and I've been standing in this street for an hour, trying to decide if it's too late." Mabel looked at him. "It's not too late," she said. "Come inside." She spent the next 2 hours doing a version of the previous night's work for the new arrivals, but faster, more compressed, because she understood the shape of it better now, and because these people came already half convinced. They'd heard about the gathering secondhand, from neighbors, or from someone who had passed the information along the invisible network that small communities developed for exactly this kind of information. William Cord's 80 acres were documented in Bram's original evidence collection, and she was able to show him exactly where his deed had been manipulated and exactly what that manipulation looked like in the context of the larger pattern. By 7 in the morning, she had 6 more signed statements. William Cord's and 5 others, including one that surprised her, a man named Patrick Farrow, who had worked for the county recording office 2 years earlier and had been quietly let go after he'd raised questions about a series of filings he thought were irregular. Farrow was nervous in the way of someone who understood that what he was about to say had professional and possibly legal implications for him. He was a thin man in his late 30s, with ink-stained fingers out of old habit and the careful manner of a former bureaucrat. "I raised the questions in writing," he said. "Formally. I sent a memo to the county commissioner's office." He looked at his hands. 3 days later, I was told my position was being eliminated for budget reasons. I was given 2 weeks' wages and asked to return my keys." He paused, kept a copy of the memo. Mabel looked at him. "Do you have it with you?" He reached into his coat and produced it. The memo was 18 months old and slightly worn at the folds, the way documents were when they'd been taken out and refolded many times. Mabel read it carefully. It was specific. Farrow had noted 4 of the same irregularities she'd identified, including the stamp issue, in formal bureaucratic language that carried the particular credibility of something written by someone who was not angry or frightened at the time of writing, but was simply doing their job and finding something that shouldn't be there. "This goes with the federal marshal's materials," Mabel said. "This is Mr. Farrow. This is significant. This is a county employee raising the alarm in writing 18 months ago, which establishes that the irregularities were not only detectable, but were actually detected and then suppressed." She looked at him. "Were you aware of that significance when you kept the copy?" Farrow was quiet for a moment. "I kept it because I thought I might need it someday," he said. "I wasn't sure for what exactly. I just knew that something had happened that wasn't right, and that the copy was the only proof that I'd done my job correctly." He paused. "I didn't know how to use it. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't know who to take it to that Vane couldn't reach." "You take it to a federal authority," Mabel said. "The same place everything else goes." She placed it carefully with her other documents. "And for the record, you did do your job correctly. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. That you were removed for it is part of the case, not a reflection on you." Something in Farrow's posture changed. Small change. But she saw it. By 8 o'clock the morning had brought one more complication, which was that word had clearly reached Thaddeus Vane that his strategy of sending men to stand in the street and watch the inn had not produced the desired quieting effect. Because at 8:05, a man arrived at the inn's front door with a letter addressed to Mabel in handwriting she didn't recognize. The letter was from Vane's lawyer. It was 3 paragraphs of polished legal language that said, "In essence, the property challenges filed the previous day were procedurally defective and would be contested on those grounds, Mrs. Whitlock was potentially subject to a defamation claim for statements allegedly made in a public gathering, and Vane remained open to a settlement conference at his convenience." Mabel read it twice. Then she set it on the table. "He's worried," Bram said from across the table. "He's performing not being worried," Mabel said, which is a different thing. She looked at the letter again. "Procedurally defective. Let me think about what that means." She thought about it. The challenges she'd filed the previous morning had been stamped and registered by Fenwick. The procedural requirements for filing were established in the territorial challenge, were established in the territorial code, and she had followed them carefully because she'd known Vane would look for exactly this kind of technical argument. She went back through the filings in her mind, the specific steps, the document numbers, the fee payments she'd made from her remaining $11.40, which had taken most of them. She didn't think he had a real procedural argument. She thought he had a lawyer who was good at writing letters that sounded like real procedural arguments, which was a different thing, and a useful distinction. "He wants a settlement conference. At his convenience," Lenora said, reading over Mabel's shoulder. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "At his convenience. Which means he wants to choose the terms of the conversation," Mabel said. which means he wants to get me into a room where he controls the environment before the marshal gets here. She set the letter aside. We're not having a settlement conference. She wrote a response. It was one paragraph. It said that she would be happy to discuss any legitimate procedural concerns before the court in a formal setting, that she was not available for a private conference, and that any communications from Vane or his representatives should be directed to her lawyer, whose name and Jefferson City address she provided, because she had spent 15 minutes the night before composing a letter to him, and she intended to use him as a shield before he'd even agreed to be one. She had the stable boy deliver it. At 8:30, Silas Ketchum came to the inn. He came alone again, which she was beginning to understand was a deliberate choice on his part rather than an accident. Silas, when he was operating from his own judgment rather than Vane's direction, moved quietly. He knocked at the front door rather than walking in. Lenora let him in with an expression of minimal hospitality. He looked worse than last night. He had not slept. There was something in his face that had moved past the calculations of the previous evening into something rawer and less organized. Vane contacted me this morning, Silas said, without sitting down. Before 6. He told me there were people at the recorder's office yesterday who saw Mrs. Whitlock filing things. He knows about the gathering. He doesn't know what was said, but he knows who was here. He paused. He told me to come talk to you today. Find out what you're planning. He said he used the word take care of any problems I might be concerned about if I helped him manage this situation. He wants you to spy, Mabel said. Yes, and you're here telling me this instead. Silas put his hand on the back of a chair, not sitting, just holding on to something. I've been doing what that man tells me for 3 years, he said. I've done things in that time that He stopped. I need to know that what I told you last night is going to matter. That it's not just going to disappear into some process that Vane's lawyers bury under paperwork for 5 years. Mabel looked at him for a moment. She thought about Everett Calloway, who had been the best company Bram ever had, and who was dead because of a plan Silas had participated in without knowing all of it, which was not the same as innocence, but was also not the same as Vane. What you told me last night is in writing, signed, witnessed, and notarized, she said. It cannot disappear. The moment the marshal reads it, it becomes part of a federal investigation record, and federal investigation records are not things that territorial lawyers can bury. She held his gaze. What I cannot promise you is the outcome for you specifically. That's not mine to promise. What I can tell you is that the account you gave was detailed, specific, and internally consistent, and that it connects things that the documentary evidence alone doesn't connect. She paused. It matters. And I think you already knew that, or you wouldn't have said it. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Vane told me something else, he said. Morning. He looked at the table. He said if the challenges aren't withdrawn by end of day, he's going to file a claim directly contesting your deed registration. He has grounds, he says. Questions about the legitimacy of the inheritance transfer from your father. The room got very still. That's a lie, Mabel said. The documents were in order. She had verified them herself, and Fenwick had verified them. And they were in the territorial record, and they were sound. I know it's a lie, Silas said. I'm telling you what he said. He's going to file a fraudulent challenge, Bram said from the doorway. He's not going to try to prove it. He's going to create a legal cloud over your registration that requires a hearing to resolve. And in the meantime, your deed is in dispute, and so is any standing. You have to challenge his transfers. Yes, Silas said. That's what he described. Mabel sat with this for a moment. She felt the familiar shape of it, the same mechanism, different target. If Vane filed a challenge against her deed registration, even a fraudulent one, she would be in exactly the position all these other families had been in, fighting a legal action she hadn't created, with her own resources, in a court system where Vane had connections. The difference was that she'd seen this mechanism from the inside now, and she understood it in a way that William Cord and Dora Hatch and the Paulson brothers hadn't when it happened to them. Understanding a trap and having a way out of it were not always the same thing. When would he file? She said to Silas. He said end of day. She looked at Bram. Bram was already doing the same calculation she was doing. She could see it on his face. The marshal could not possibly arrive by end of day. She had sent letters the night before, but letters traveled at coach speed, and the nearest marshal's office was a day and a half away. Fenwick, she said. Bram looked at her. The county recorder has discretion over challenges to deed registration, she said. He can accept them for processing, or he can require additional verification before processing, if there's reason to believe the challenge is filed in bad faith. She was working through the territorial code in her mind. The way you worked through a filing system you knew well, not perfectly, not every detail, but the architecture of it, the shape of where things lived. Section 22. It's a discretionary provision that recorders almost never use because almost no one ever files a bad faith deed challenge. There's no reason to, normally, because the downside risk is severe. But the provision exists. Fenwick won't use it, Bram said. He doesn't like conflict. He especially doesn't like conflict with Vane. No, Mabel said, but he might use it if the argument for bad faith is so clear and so documented that refusing to use it puts him personally at legal risk. She stood. I need to go back to the recorder's office. Vane's lawyer might already be there, Lenora said. Then I need to be there first, Mabel said. She was at the recorder's office by 9:05. The lawyer, as Lenora had predicted, arrived 12 minutes later, a composed man in a good coat who introduced himself as Gerald Pratt and who spoke to Fenwick with the easy familiarity of someone who had conducted business in this office before and expected that familiarity to be useful. Mabel had spent those 12 minutes laying out the argument for Fenwick. She had done it without theatrics, just the statutory provision. The documentation of the fraudulent filing she'd already identified. The pattern of bad faith legal actions used as financial weapons against people who couldn't afford to fight them. And the specific argument that a challenge to her deed registration filed by an entity currently under documented challenge for federal land fraud was, on its face, a bad faith action intended to cloud legitimate title rather than resolve a genuine dispute. She also told Fenwick about Patrick Farrow's memo. She didn't show it to him. She was not going to use that document for anything other than the marshal's investigation, but she told him it existed, and she told him what it said, and she told him that a county recorder who had been sent a memo by a county employee 18 months ago identifying these exact irregularities, and whose office had continued to process filings from the same entities identified in that memo, was a county recorder who would benefit significantly from being very clearly on the right side of what was coming next. Fenwick had gone pale at the mention of Farrow's memo, gone paler when she described what it said. By the time Gerald Pratt arrived, Fenwick had not committed to anything, but the quality of his uncertainty had changed. Pratt laid out Vane's challenge to Mabel's deed registration with smooth competence. Cited procedural grounds she had expected, and one she hadn't a question about the chain of the inheritance transfer that was technically creative and factually wrong, but was wrong in a way that would require documentation to refute, which was the point. When he finished, Mabel said, Mr. Fenwick, I'd like to formally request that you invoke your discretionary review authority under Section 22 before processing this challenge. Fenwick looked at her. He looked at Pratt. He looked at the documents on his counter. Pratt said, smoothly, Mr. Fenwick, that provision is intended for clear cases of harassment, not for contested property matters between parties with legitimate. The entity filing this challenge, Mabel said, is directly connected to 11 property transfers currently under formal challenge for fraudulent notarization, backdated documentation, and false corporate declarations. The filing is being made by the admission of Silas Ketchum in a witnessed and notarized statement dated last night as a deliberate strategy to cloud my title and impair my standing in the existing challenges. Placed a copy of Silas's statement on the counter. Not the original was packed with her other materials, but a copy she'd made at Lenora's table that morning. Section 22 does not require the bad faith to be proven. It requires reasonable grounds to believe it may exist. I have submitted a signed, notarized statement from Vane's own agent saying this challenge is strategically motivated rather than substantively legitimate. The room was very quiet. Pratt said, that statement is from an individual with obvious personal motivation to tell the truth, Mabel said. Yes. His motivation to tell the truth is significant and documented. Fenwick picked up Silas's statement. He read it. His face did several things in sequence. He set it down. He picked up the Section 22 provision in the territorial code book he'd had to retrieve from a shelf that was clearly not frequently accessed. He read it. I'm going to require additional verification before processing this challenge, he said finally. Under Section 22, I'll notify both parties when verification is complete. Pratt's composure developed a small crack. Mr. Fenwick, this is highly irregular. It's the law, Fenwick said. He sounded slightly surprised by his own voice. The provision is in the code. I'm applying it. He looked at Pratt. You're welcome to contest that application in court, Mr. Pratt. Pratt left with his composure reassembled but his purpose unaccomplished, and Mabel thanked Fenwick in the brisk, professional way that she'd found worked better with men like him than effusive gratitude, and she walked back out into the cold. Bram was waiting outside. He'd been waiting outside because she'd asked him to stay visible on the street, rather than coming in visible and calm, so that anyone watching would see that Calloway was not inside the recorder's office creating trouble, but was simply a man standing on a public sidewalk, which was not anything anyone could object to. Well, he said. He invoked Section 22, Mabel said. Bram looked at her. I didn't know Fenwick had that in him. He didn't either, Mabel said. But I gave him a very clear picture of what being on the wrong side of this was going to look like, and Arthur Fenwick is a man who cares a great deal about his professional standing. I think the picture was persuasive. She started walking. Now we need Silas in front of someone today. Someone official. Because Vane is going to figure out by noon that Fenwick blocked the challenge. And when that happens, he's going to stop working through lawyers and start working through other methods. What other methods? I don't know specifically, Mabel said. But the man who he used for what he called situations that required a different approach, the man Silas mentioned. Doyle, I don't know where Doyle is or what he's been told. And that bothers me. Bram's jaw tightened. I know the name Doyle. He left the area about 6 months ago, and I assumed he'd moved on. If Vane brought him back, then we need to not be predictable about where we are and what we're doing, Mabel said. Lenora's Inn is the obvious place. We should not be there this afternoon. Where then? Mabel thought. Dora Hatch's property, she said. Dora's place is east of town. It's defensible. She's already committed. And if Vane is watching Lenora's Inn for movement, he won't immediately think of Dora. She paused. Will Dora have us? Send word and ask, Bram said. They sent word through the stable boy, who was proving to be an unexpectedly reliable courier, and who seemed to understand instinctively that the information he was carrying required discretion without needing to be told. Dora's response came back in 20 minutes, yes. Come whenever you need to. Bring who you need to bring. The rest of the morning was logistics, gathering the people who needed to be gathered, moving without making the movement obvious, keeping Silas informed without letting his information reach Vane. Silas had gone back to his usual residence and was, as far as they could determine, maintaining the appearance of normal activity. He had not, as far as Mabel could tell, told Vane about last night's statements or this morning's conversation, which either meant he'd fully committed to cooperation or meant he was keeping his options open. She couldn't be certain which, and she couldn't afford to be wrong about it. At Dora Hatch's property, a well-kept farmstead, with a solidly built house and a small barn that spoke of someone who had maintained things carefully through hard circumstances, Mabel spread the documents on Dora's kitchen table and worked through the afternoon on the organizational structure of what she was going to hand the marshal. She wanted it clear and sequential. She wanted each piece of evidence to build on the one before it, so the investigator didn't have to assemble the story himself, but could see it laid out in the order that made it comprehensible. Greer arrived mid-afternoon without being asked, which told her something about where his decision had landed. He sat across the table and helped her cross-reference the water rights documentation against the corporate filing records with the quiet intensity of a man who had been waiting for 2 years to do something constructive with his anger. The Paulson brothers came an hour later and stationed themselves, without being asked, at visible points around the property's perimeter. Not armed, or at least not visibly armed, but present. Watching. Bram sat at the far end of the table and said almost nothing all afternoon, which Mabel had come to understand was not disengagement, but his mode of useful presence being there, steady, without requiring management or conversation. Dora moved around her kitchen with the purposeful efficiency of a woman on her own property who intended to stay that way. She made coffee without asking if anyone wanted it, and produced food at intervals that were practical rather than ceremonial. At 4 in the afternoon, the stable boy arrived breathless again. Silas Ketchum went into Vane's office an hour ago, he said between breaths. He was in there for about 20 minutes. When he came out, he walked to the deputy's office. The table went very still. Not Vane's men's direction, the boy continued. The actual deputy's office. And he went in, and he hasn't come out. Mabel set down her pen. He went to the deputy himself, Bram said. He's getting ahead of it, Mabel said. She felt something complicated move through her not quite relief, because relief was premature, but something that was relief's more cautious cousin. He went to Vane's office, and whatever Vane said to him in there was enough to make him walk straight to the law. She paused. Either Vane threatened him specifically enough that Silas calculated the threat was worse than the consequences of cooperating, or Vane said something about what he plans to do tonight, Bram said. And Silas didn't want to be standing next to it when it happened. They looked at each other. We need to know what Silas told the deputy, Mabel said. And we need to know right now. Bram was already on his feet. I'll go. Carefully, Mabel said. We don't know whose side the deputy is on yet. I know Marcus Hale, Bram said. We're not friends, but I know him. He's not Vane's man. He's just cautious. Like Fenwick, he paused at the door. I'll be back in an hour. He was back in 40 minutes, and when he came through the door of Dora's kitchen, his face was carrying news that he was managing carefully. Silas told the deputy everything, Bram said. The whole account. The letters to you, the campaign against the settlers, the mechanism for the deed fraud, Doyle's involvement. And he stopped, and something passed across his face that was difficult to read from the outside. And he told Marcus about Everett, what Vane said to him after, the specific words. The kitchen was very quiet. Dora had stopped moving. Greer had set down the document he'd been holding. Marcus Hale has sent a writer to the marshal's office, Bram continued. Not a letter, a writer. And he's detained Silas in a room at his office, not arrested, but detained for Silas's own safety, which means Marcus believes what Silas told him about the threat level. He paused. He also sent 2 men to find Doyle. Does he know where Doyle is? Mabel said. Not yet. But Silas gave him 3 locations where Doyle typically stayed when he was in the area. He looked at Mabel directly. Marcus wants to talk to you. Tonight. He wants everything you have, all the filed documents, the statements, the Pharaoh memo. He's going to start putting together an official account before the marshal arrives, so that when the marshal gets here, there's already a record that's been established by a local officer. Mabel looked at the documents spread across Dora's table. The organized, cross-referenced, methodically assembled architecture of 2.5 days of work. He can have all of it, she said. That's what it's for. She began packaging the materials with the careful precision she'd brought to everything. In the past 3 days, the originals in the oilskin, the copies organized separately, everything numbered and annotated, so that a person picking it up cold could follow the chain of evidence without needing her to explain it. She had been building toward exactly this handoff. The point had never been for her to carry this alone. The point had been to build something solid enough that the right institution could pick it up and carry it the rest of the way. Greer said from across the table, "What do we do now?" Mabel looked at him. At the lined, weathered face of a man who had been carrying his particular piece of this for 2 years. Now we wait, she said. And we don't make it easy for anything to happen to these documents, or to the people who signed their names to them. She looked around the kitchen. Greer, the Paulson brothers visible through the window, Dora at the counter, Bram at the door. Nobody here is alone in this anymore. That's the most important thing that's changed in the last 3 days. Whatever Vane tries to do tonight, he's doing it against a group of people with a documented record and a local deputy who is now officially involved. She paused. Structure holds. We just have to hold it through tonight. She was nearly finished organizing the documents when the sound came not from the road, not from the direction of town, but from the eastern edge of the property, where the older Paulson brother had been standing. A shout, sharp and short, followed by running footsteps. Bram had the door open before anyone else had fully processed the sounds, and Mabel was right behind him, leaving the documents on Dora's table where they were. The older Paulson brother was pointing. Out beyond the property line, in the direction of the dry scrub that ran east from Dora's fence, there was a moving light, low and orange, moving in the wrong direction for a lantern carried by a walking person. The east field, Dora said behind them. Her voice had gone to something tight and controlled. That's the grass. If that gets into the grass. Get water, Bram said, already moving toward it. Bram, Mabel said. I know, he said without stopping. But it's her land. The next 40 minutes were not organized or strategic. They were just people doing what needed doing, beating back the small fire that someone had set in the dry winter scrub along Dora's eastern fence line with whatever came to hand, Greer with a feed sack, the Paulson brothers with horse blankets, Mabel with a bucket of water that Dora pressed into her hands and then went back to refill and pressed into the next person's hands. The fire had not been set to burn the house. Whoever set it had started it too far from the main structures for that not to be the goal. It was a message. Stay afraid. I can reach you here. They got it out. Took all of them, and it was ugly, and Mabel's arms and shoulders would ache for 3 days afterward, and at one point she went down on her bad knee in the dark and came back up without stopping because the alternative was the alternative. They got it out. When it was done, they stood in the cold, breathing hard, smelling of smoke, and looked at each other in the dark. He's watching, the younger Paulson said. Whoever set that is watching. Let him watch, Dora said. Her voice had the particular steadiness of a woman standing on her own land saying a thing she meant from the center of herself. He can watch me not leave. She looked at the scorched ground. Franklin built this fence. I'm not moving off this property because someone is afraid of what I signed my name to last night. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Mabel said, we go back inside. We secure the documents. And we send word to Marcus Hale about what just happened, because attempted intimidation against a witness who has already given testimony to the deputy is a different category of crime than anything Vane has done so far. She looked at Bram. This goes in the record. Tonight. Everything that just happened. Bram was looking at the scorched fence line with an expression she recognized now, the one where he was thinking something through before he said it. He's getting desperate, Bram said. Vane doesn't make moves like this when he thinks he's winning. He makes them when he's trying to stop something he can already see coming. The marshal, Greer said. He knows the rider went out. He knows, Bram said. And he knows he has one night left before this is past the point where he can manage it. He turned and looked at Mabel. He's going to try something bigger than a fence fire before morning. I know, Mabel said. We should move the documents. Yes, she said. Not to the inn, not to your place. Not anywhere he would think to look first. She thought for a moment. Marcus Hale's office. Tonight. If the documents are in the deputy's official custody, touching them becomes a crime against the county, not just against us. Bram was already nodding before she finished. I'll take them now. I'll come with you, she said. Mabel, I'll come with you, she said again. Turned to Dora. Can the Paulson brothers stay here tonight? They can have the barn, Dora said. Not graciously, practically. Like a woman allocating resources on her own terms. The older Paulson brother said, We'll stay. Mabel went back inside and finished packing the documents. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. That was the strange thing about the last 3 days. The fear had been there constantly. A low, persistent current under everything. But it had not taken her apart. She had been more frightened, she thought. Standing at the depot when Silas first grabbed her arm, in the specific isolation of not knowing what came next, than she was now with a scorched fence line on someone else's property and a man somewhere out in the dark who'd set the fire. Now she knew what came next, and that was its own kind of steadying. She picked up the oilskin packet and looked at Bram. Ready, she said. They went out into the cold and the dark together, and behind them Dora Hatch closed the door of her house, the house Franklin Hatch had built and did not leave it. Marcus Hale's office was a single room at the north end of the main street, with 2 cells in the back and a desk that had seen better decades. It smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the particular staleness of a space where men spent long nights doing things they'd rather not be doing. When Mabel and Bram came through the door at 9:30 with the oilskin packet, Marcus was awake and waiting, which told her that the news of the fence fire had already reached him through whatever channel small towns used for exactly that kind of information. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with a deputy's badge, and the cautious, measuring eyes of someone who had survived in a difficult job by being very careful about what he committed to. He looked at the oilskin packet on his desk, and then he looked at Mabel. And she could see him doing the same recalibration that men in this town kept having to do when they actually looked at her, instead of the category they'd assigned her to on site. Tell me about the fire first, he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, made notes, asked 2 specific questions about the direction the fire had started and how long it had burned before they got it out. He was thorough in the way of someone who understood that details mattered in official accounts. Then she laid the documents out for him. All of it the challenged filings, the stamp issue with its documentary support, the three-company analysis, the cross-referenced witness signatures, the Paulson and Greer and Hatch materials, Silas's signed statement, and Patrick Farrow's memo, placed last, and which Marcus picked up and read twice. I knew Pat Farrow, Marcus said when he finished reading it. He was good at his job. He was doing exactly his job, Mabel said, and he was removed for it. That memo needs to be in the marshal's materials. Will be. Marcus set it down carefully. He looked at the organized totality of what was spread across his desk. You put this together in 3 days. 2.5, Mabel said. The documentary evidence was mostly already there. Bram had collected the pieces. I just understood what the pieces meant when you put them next to each other. Marcus looked at Bram. You've been working on this for 6 months. She found things in 6 hours that I missed in 6 months, Bram said. There was no bitterness in it, just the plain accounting of a man who was honest about what he was good at and what he wasn't. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Silas is in the back room. He's going to sleep here tonight, for his own safety as much as anything else. In the morning, when the marshal arrives, the marshal is coming tomorrow, Mabel said. My rider was fast, and the marshal was already moving this direction on a separate matter. He'll be here by mid-morning. Marcus paused. I need these documents in my official custody tonight. Logged, witnessed, entered into the county record as materials submitted to the deputy's office in support of a formal investigation. He looked at Mabel. Once they're logged here, anyone who tries to interfere with them is interfering with an official investigation. That's a different category of crime. That's exactly why I brought them here, Mabel said. The logging took an hour. Marcus was meticulous about it, every document numbered. Described, dated in the log, witnessed by both Mabel and Bram and signed by all three. By the time they were done, the lamp had burned low, and Marcus's handwriting, which had started neat, had developed the slight looseness of a man writing past 10 o'clock after a long day. He blotted the last entry and looked up. Go get some sleep, he said. Both of you. I'll have 2 men watching this office through the night. Whatever Vane is planning, he won't move on an official deputy's office. He paused. Probably. The probably is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Bram said. Yes, Marcus said. It is. Go sleep anyway. You're not going to be useful to anyone tomorrow if you've been awake all night. They walked back to Lenora's inn through the cold dark. The town was quiet around them, not the easy quiet of an ordinary night, but the particular held-breath quiet of a place where people had gone inside and were waiting for something to resolve. Mabel had felt that quality in the air before, in Missouri, during the bad winter when the flooding came and everyone waited to see how high the water would rise. It was the quiet of people who were not sleeping easily, but had decided that the only thing left to do was wait. At the inn, Lenora was still up. She had soup on, which Mabel suspected was less about hunger and more about Lenora needing something to do with her hands. Mabel ate it because her body needed it, and because refusing it would have been unkind. Bram ate it too, and they sat at the table in the warm kitchen for a while without talking much, and that was fine. There was not much left to say that night that the day hadn't already covered. Mabel went upstairs and lay down and did not sleep for a while. She lay in the dark and let herself think about the things she'd been managing around the edges of the 40 acres, which were now in the record and real in a way they hadn't been when she'd stepped off the stagecoach, the life she'd left in Missouri, which had not been bad exactly, but had been characterized by a kind of low-level invisibility that she'd stopped noticing until she noticed it wasn't there anymore. And Bram Calloway, who was something she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she had the right language for yet. She thought about what it meant that a man could look at her, all of her, the size of her, the stubbornness of her, the ink-stained hands and the bad knee, and the temper she managed with effort, and not seem to need any of it to be different. Not make her feel that his regard was contingent on her becoming smaller or easier or less. She'd spent enough of her life around men who wanted her to be less that she'd almost forgotten it was possible to be seen whole. Almost. She went to sleep eventually, and slept without dreaming, and woke to pale winter light and the sound of a horse on the frozen street below. The marshal arrived at 11 in the morning. His name was Daniel Court, and he was a tall, angular man of about 50, with a federal badge and the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had stopped being dramatic about it. He came with 2 deputies and he went straight to Marcus Hale's office, where Marcus had been since dawn, and he was in there for an hour before he sent word that he wanted to speak with Mabel. She went alone. Bram waited outside because she asked him to, and because she understood that the most important thing right now was for the marshal to see the case, as it was built on documents and statements and the records of the county recorder's office rather than as something that required a man standing nearby to validate it. Court had the documents spread across Marcus's desk when she came in, which meant he'd been going through them already and had not waited for her to walk him through them. That was a good sign. He looked up when she came in, and he looked at her with the flat, assessing attention of a man whose job required him to be accurate about people quickly. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Sit down." She sat. "Walk me through the notary stamp issue," he said. "In your own words." From the beginning. She walked him through it. He listened without expression, asked sharp, specific questions at the relevant points. Questions that told her he understood the territorial filing code better than she'd expected and was already seeing the implications without needing her to spell them all out. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents. "The 3-company structure," he said. "You identified this from the public record alone? Cross-referencing the filing agents, the notary signatures, the deed description language, and the Denver address," she said. "The individual elements aren't hidden. Nobody expected them to be connected, because they're filed under different company names. You only see the pattern if you look at all 3 sets of filings at the same time. And nobody had done that. Nobody with the training to know what they were looking at had done it," Mabel said. "Or nobody with that training had been in a position to do it, or hadn't been removed from that position before they could." She paused. "Patrick Farrow's memo is in that stack. He found some of the same things 18 months ago and was let go 3 days later." Court found the memo. He read it. His expression did not change, which she was coming to understand was not blankness, but a kind of professional containment. The face of a man who did not let what he was thinking become visible until he'd decided what to do with it. "I'm going to need a formal statement from you," he said, "covering everything from your arrival to this morning. Not today. I have other interviews to conduct first. Tomorrow morning." "I'll be here," Mabel said. "I'm also going to need the original documents. Not the copies logged with Marcus, the originals." "They're in my room at the inn," she said. "I kept the originals separate from what I gave Marcus. You can have them today." Court looked at her for a moment. "You kept the originals separate as a precaution." "Yes, because the copies in Marcus's custody were a recorded set, and the originals in your custody were a separate set, so that interference with one didn't destroy both." "Yes," Mabel said. Court was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitlock, in 30 years of this work, I have had very few occasions to review fraud documentation that was organized this clearly before I arrived on the scene." He said it the way he said everything, without heat, without performance. Just factual. "Thank you for your work on this." She nodded once. Then she went back out into the cold. Bram was leaning against the wall of the building across the street, and he straightened when he saw her come out, reading her face. "Well," he said. "He's thorough and he understands the code," she said. "He's going to make arrests today." Bram looked down the street toward Vane's office building. "Does he know where Doyle is?" "I didn't ask," Mabel said. "I expect Marcus told him." She paused. "We should tell Dora, and Greer, and the others. They should hear it from us rather than from the street." They spent the rest of the morning doing exactly that, moving through the town's network of frightened people, telling them what was happening, making sure no one had to find out through rumor or inference. Dora Hatch, when they came to tell her, was in the process of mending her eastern fence in the cold morning air, and she listened to what Mabel said, and then went back to mending the fence, not dismissively, with the attitude of a woman who had work that needed doing, regardless of what the law was handling. "Franklin would have liked you," Dora said to Mabel, without stopping what she was doing. Mabel didn't know what to say to that. "I'm glad your fence is standing," she said finally. "Franklin built it to last," Dora said. "So did I." Thaddeus Vane was arrested at 2 in the afternoon. Marshal Court did it with his 2 deputies and the efficiency of someone who had made many arrests and found no value in adding drama to them. Vane came out of his office building with Gerald Pratt beside him, and Pratt attempted 3 sentences of legal protest before court quietly explained that this was a federal action, and Pratt's territorial court connections were not relevant to it. And Vane walked to the federal custody with the rigid composure of a man who was furious and was controlling it, because losing composure now was a concession he refused to make. Mabel watched from across the street. She did not feel the rush of triumph she might have expected. What she felt was something quieter than that, a slow, deep settling, like something that had been held taut for days finally being allowed to release. Doyle was found the following morning at one of the locations Silas had identified, in a boarding house 8 miles east. He did not come willingly, but he came, and the evidence connecting him to the incidents against the settled families and to the circumstances of Everett Calloway's death was something Silas's account and subsequent investigation would spend the next several months making precise and prosecutable. Silas himself cooperated fully. His cooperation was not pretty or dramatic or particularly redemptive in the clean narrative sense. He was a man who had done damaging things to people who hadn't deserved it, and the cooperation didn't change the things he'd done. Changed what he did next. The marshal's recommendation on his case reflected that distinction, and the outcome for him was serious without being final, which was probably the most honest assessment of where he belonged in the accounting. The legal process that followed was long and imperfect, and sometimes maddening in the way that legal processes were when powerful interests were involved, and the machinery of the law ran on its own rhythm, regardless of urgency. Vane's lawyers filed continuances and contested evidence, and raised procedural challenges that required responses, and the responses took time, and the time required patience that did not always come easily to people who were waiting to recover what had been taken from them. But the cases held. The documentary evidence was too specific and too cross-corroborated to be dismantled by procedural pressure. The federal jurisdictions insulated the proceedings from the territorial court connections Vane had spent years cultivating. Patrick Farrow's memo, entered into the federal record, established a timeline of detection and suppression that made every subsequent action by Vane's operation look like what it was: not aggressive business dealing, but organized criminal enterprise. The fraudulent deed transfers were overturned one by one over the following months. The Paulson brothers got their east pasture back. Greer's water rights were restored, and the company that had filed against them was dissolved when its fraudulent corporate declarations were proven. William Cord's 80 acres were recovered, though he had to take out a loan against them to cover the legal fees for the recovery proceedings, which was an injustice of its own particular flavor, the kind that was not anyone's fault exactly, but was still a weight that the original wrong had left behind. Dora Hatch's property dispute was resolved in her favor by the end of spring. The 15 acres that had been claimed under the fraudulent notary stamp were returned to her with the legal fees for the challenge paid by the federal recovery process, which was rare enough to feel significant. She went back to running her property alone, and she mended fences and planted what Franklin Hatch had planned to plant the spring he died, and she did not leave. Bram Calloway got Everett's land back. Took 9 months and 2 separate legal proceedings, but the forged signature evidence was ultimately the foundation of both the case against Doyle and the property recovery action, and in the end the Calloway name went back on the deed. Bram stood in Everett's house, which had been maintained badly under Vane's control and needed significant work, and looked around the rooms for a long time without saying anything. Mabel stood in the doorway behind him and did not say anything either, because this was not a moment that needed words from her. When he turned around, his face was doing what it did when he was feeling something that he decided to feel properly, rather than manage past. A kind of open, unguarded quality that she had come to understand was not weakness, but the opposite of it, the ability to let a thing land. Everett always said this house needed a bigger kitchen, Bram said finally. He was right, Mabel said. The layout doesn't make sense. Bram almost smiled. You've been in here for 30 seconds. I can see it doesn't make sense in 30 seconds, she said. The stove is on the wrong wall for the light. He looked at the stove wall, looked at the window. He did complain about that, he said. Then he had good instincts. They stood in Everett's house in the late afternoon light and looked at what was there and what needed to be done, and both of them understood without saying, so that they were not really talking about the kitchen. Mabel had stayed in Coldwater Ridge through the legal proceedings because her presence was needed for the investigation and the formal challenge processes. She had stayed after that because her 40 acres were there, and she had begun to understand what she wanted to do with them, and also because she had opened a small bookkeeping and records office in the 2 rooms above Lenore's inn, and within 6 weeks had more work than she could handle. The work came from the direction she'd expected: families who needed help understanding contracts before they signed them, widows managing property they'd never had to manage alone before, immigrants filing homestead claims who needed someone who could explain the code in plain language. But it also came from directions she hadn't anticipated: merchants who needed proper accounts kept, a small cattle outfit whose owner was literate but not in the particular way that made ledger work natural, 2 young women who wanted to learn bookkeeping themselves and had nobody to teach them, taught them. She remembered what it had been like to be the only woman in the Jefferson City land office, and to have learned everything from a man who'd treated her knowledge as a fact about her rather than a compliment to her. Not warmly, not with mentorship, but accurately. Taught differently than that. She taught the way you taught things, worth knowing, with patience for the questions and intolerance for the idea that understanding was limited by who was asking. The people who had whispered about the bruised, oversized mail-order bride, who had arrived on the December stagecoach, found that by spring they were seeking her out for different reasons. Not because they'd changed their first impressions gracefully. Most people did not change first impressions gracefully. That was not how first impressions worked, but because the evidence of what she was kept accumulating until the impressions they'd made on first sight simply became less interesting than the actual person. There were still people in Coldwater Ridge who looked at her and saw her size before they saw anything else. There always would be. She had stopped waiting for that to change. What she had learned, in the months since the December stagecoach, was that other people's vision of you was their problem to solve. Not yours, that you could spend your life trying to make yourself small enough to be palatable to people who had decided you were too large in every sense. Or you could take up the space you actually occupied and do something worth doing in it. She had tried the first way for most of her adult life. The second way suited her better. One evening in late summer, Bram came to the records office with a rolled tube of paper under his arm and the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is trying to decide whether they're to use the rehearsed version or the honest one. He unrolled the papers on her desk. Architectural plans, rough, hand-drawn but careful. A house on the restored Calloway land. She looked at the layout: 2 bedrooms with walls thick enough for the Colorado winters. Kitchen on the east wall where the light would come through in the morning. A room off the main hall that was larger than a storage room and smaller than a parlor, with a window facing the road and a notation in Bram's handwriting that said records room. She looked at the records room for a long time. The window faces the road, she said. People need to be able to see the light from outside, Bram said, so they know when you're working. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention he'd had since the first day, that direct, undivided quality of a man who was looking at what was actually there, rather than what he decided should be there. This is a large assumption, she said. I know it is, he said. I'm aware of that. You could have asked first. I started with the plans because the plans were the honest version of asking, he said. The plans say this is what I want. What do you want? She looked at the kitchen on the east wall, the records room facing the road. 2 bedrooms with the thick walls. I want to know why the second bedroom is larger than the first, she said. Bram looked at the plans. That's the one facing east, he said. More light in the morning. I thought you'd prefer it. You thought I'd take the larger bedroom. I thought you'd want the better light, he said. Which isn't the same thing, except in this case it is. She studied him. He stood on the other side of her desk, with his hat in his hands, and his face doing the honest, unguarded thing it did when he wasn't managing himself for an audience. And she thought about the stagecoach depot and the frozen creek and the long night at the cabin table with 6 months of evidence between them, and about the hand offered in the dark and then withdrawn when she didn't need it, and about a man who had never once looked at her body as an argument about what she was capable of. She thought about how rare that was. She thought about how she had almost not noticed it at first because she hadn't expected it, and the mind was not always quick to recognize what it hadn't expected. Kitchen layout is still wrong, she said. Bram blinked. I told you Everett complained about the stove wall. I'm not talking about Everett's house, Mabel said. I'm talking about these plans. If the kitchen faces east and the stove is on the north wall, You lose the cross-ventilation in summer. She picked up her pen and turned the plans toward her. You want the stove on the south wall. Here, she made a small notation. And the work table under the east window, where the light is. Bram was quiet for a moment, looking at the notation. You're redesigning my kitchen, he said. Our kitchen, Mabel said. She said it the way she said most things that were true plainly, without performance, because the plain version was accurate, and the accurate version was the one worth saying. The room was very quiet. Outside, the late summer light was doing the particular thing it did in Colorado evenings, going golden and long-angled across the high country, the kind of light that made everything look considered and deliberate, as if the landscape had chosen this specific moment to be exactly this. Bram said yes, just that. One word quiet meaning everything it needed to mean. She finished the notation on the kitchen. She looked at the records room window one more time. Then she rolled the plans carefully and handed them back to him. She thought, not for the first time, about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in December with $11 and a carpet bag and bruises she hadn't yet had time to examine. That woman had been frightened and exhausted, and had believed, in some quiet corner of herself, that the best she could expect from whatever came next was a bearable arrangement. That she was not, at this point in her life, someone for whom more than bearable was a realistic expectation. What she understood now, that she hadn't understood then, was that bearable had never been the actual ceiling. The ceiling had been invisible because she had been looking at herself through the eyes of people who needed her to stay small, who needed her body to be an argument, men who needed her competence to be a surprise, men who needed her fear to be permanent, because her confidence threatened the particular way they'd organized their world. She had looked through those eyes for long enough that she'd started to believe what they showed her. Coldwater Ridge had not made her believe differently. One good man had not made her believe differently. What had changed it was something she'd done herself the choice, made on a freezing street in front of strangers, to say I am not going with him and mean it completely, without knowing what came after. The choice to keep moving when the ice was uncertain, and the terrain was hard, and the outcome was not guaranteed. The choice to walk through the front door of a government office and demand what the law said she was entitled to, even when her hands were not entirely steady. She had made herself believe differently, one choice at a time, and what the world had provided was the space to make those choices. That was what she tried to tell people later, when they asked about it. And they did ask travelers passing through Coldwater Ridge, heard the story of the plus-size mail-order bride who had exposed a land empire. And sometimes people came to the records office, specifically because they'd heard it and wanted to see if it was true. And sometimes they were women in circumstances that had something in common with December and a stagecoach and a man who thought shame was a reliable tool. To those women, Mabel said specific, practical things. She said, here is the territorial property code, and here is the relevant section, and here is what it means in plain language. She said, the paperwork is not as complicated as they want you to think it is. She said, I can show you what to look for, if you want to know. She said, sometimes, when the conversation had reached the place where practical information had been given and something else was still needed, the fear is real and it doesn't make you weak. What you do while you're afraid is the thing that matters. She did not say it was easy. She did not say the fear went away. She did not say that one moment of courage solved the structural problem of being a woman in a world that was often organized against women's interests, because that would have been a lie, and she had no use for lies in useful denominations. What she said was true, and it was useful, and the women who came to the records office, with the window that faced the road, went away with more than they'd arrived with. Bram built the house on the restored Calloway land that fall, with help from the Paulson brothers and Greer, and 2 men from town who showed up one Saturday without being asked and picked up tools, the way that people in small communities sometimes showed up for things, when the thing being built had a meaning beyond the building. Kitchen stove went on the south wall. The work table went under the east window. The records room faced the road, and when the lamp was lit in the evening, the light fell across the road in a way that you could see from the main track coming into the property. On the evening in late October, when the house was finished enough to be inhabited, Mabel stood in the kitchen and looked at the light coming through the east window and thought about 40 acres and a carpetbag and the particular cost of beginning again when you have been told, repeatedly by the world and by the people in it, That beginning again is not something available to women like you. Cost was real. She did not romanticize it. The bruises had healed, but the longer bruises, the ones that came from years of being looked at and found wanting, of being told that her size was the primary fact of her. That love was something she would receive only after someone graciously decided to overlook the inconvenient truth of her body. Those took longer. They were taking longer still. But she was here. She had built something. She had done it imperfectly, and with her hands shaking sometimes, and with her knee protesting every third step, and with a fear that had been her constant companion since December, and had not, despite everything, managed to be the last word. Bram came into the kitchen and stood beside her at the window. "It's a good house," he said. "It's a good house," she agreed. "Kitchen is better than I had planned." "The kitchen is better because I fixed it," Mabel said. "Yes," Bram said. "It is." He looked at her with the full, quiet attention that had not changed since the first day. "Are you going to keep correcting my plans?" "Whenever they need it," Mabel said. "What I expected," he said. "I built the records room accordingly." Outside, the late October light was going the way of October light in the high country, fast, final, the last gold draining out of the sky and leaving something clear and cold and honest behind. The lamp on the kitchen table made a warm circle against it. In the records room, the window faced the road, and anyone coming in from the main track could see the light in it from a long way off. That was the point. That had always been the point. Not to be invisible, not to make yourself small enough that no one would have reason to come at you, but to be visible fully, specifically, without apology, and to let the people who needed what you had to offer know exactly where to find you. She had come west believing she was unwanted. She had arrived bruised and frightened and holding on to the practical calculation that bearable was the realistic ceiling. She had walked off a stagecoach into the hands of a man who thought her shame was a leash, and she had said, "I am not going with him." And she had meant it, and everything that followed had followed from that. The house was real. The 40 acres were in the record. The women who came to the records office left knowing more than they'd come with. Everett Calloway's name was on his own land again, and the families of Coldwater Ridge, who had spent 2 years losing things in the dark, were in the slow, imperfect, expensive process of getting them back. None of it was without cost. None of it had been smooth. All of it had been worth the weight of it. Mabel Whitlock stood in the kitchen she had corrected and looked at the light she had refused to stop moving toward, and she did not need anyone to tell her she had earned the right to be exactly where she was. She already knew.